In the sun-drenched paradise of the Golden Palms Hotel, where hibiscus blooms hide dark secrets, a retired major's tale of a murderer's photograph sparks a deadly chain. When he dies mysteriously, followed by a maid's poisoning and a guest's staged suicide, Miss Jane Marple, a frail spinster with a razor-sharp mind, unravels a web of greed and betrayal. As the Caribbean moon casts its shadows, she sets a daring trap to catch a killer, revealing a scandalous affair and a fortune worth killing for. Will the truth shine before another life is lost? Chapter 1. The Golden Palms Hotel. Miss Jane Marple, her frail frame cushioned by a wicker chair, sat on the veranda of the Golden Palms Hotel, basking in the warm Caribbean breeze that stirred the hibiscus blossoms. St. Honor, with its turquoise bays and swaying palms, was a far cry from the damp chill of St. Mary Mead, and her rheumatism, for once, seemed to relent under the sun's gentle caress. She adjusted her lacy shawl, her pale blue eyes scanning the lively scene before her. Tourists in bright linens sipping cocktails, waiters gliding with trays of rum punch, and the distant lilt of a steel drum band drifting from the beach. At the next table, Major Palgrave, a retired officer with a weathered face and a glass eye that gleamed unnervingly, held court. His voice, booming with the confidence of a man accustomed to being heard, recounted tales of his days in India and Africa. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, listened with polite attention, though she had heard variations of these stories over the past week. The Major's anecdotes, like the man himself, were predictable yet oddly comforting in their familiarity. Much like the village gossip she so often sifted through back home. "Ever hear of a real murderer, Miss Marple?" Palgrave said suddenly, leaning forward, his good eye glinting with mischief. He patted his breast pocket, where a worn leather wallet bulged. "Got a photograph here, fellow, I met years ago. Caught him red-handed, or near enough. Never thought I'd keep such a thing, but it's a curiosity, ain't it? I'll show you tomorrow, if you like." He winked, his glass eye fixed in a disconcerting stare, and took a hearty swig of his rum punch. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles pausing. "How intriguing, Major," she murmured, her mind already turning over the implications. A photograph of a murderer. It was the sort of boastful claim one might dismiss, yet something in Palgrave's toner, hint of secrecy beneath the bluster caught her attention. She noted the flush in his cheeks, the slight tremor in his hand as he set down his glass. Too much rum, perhaps, or something else. The veranda was growing livelier as the evening deepened. At a nearby table, Tim Kendall, the hotel's young manager, chatted with a group of American guests, his boyish charm and quick smile putting them at ease. His wife, Molly, a striking woman with golden hair and a radiant laugh, moved among the tables, her grace drawing admiring glances. Yet Miss Marple, ever observant, caught a fleeting shadow in Molly's eyes, a flicker of unease that vanished as quickly as it appeared when Tim glanced her way. Further along, Edward Hillingdon, a reserved botanist with a perpetually distracted air, sat sketching the fronds of a nearby fern, his pencil moving with precise strokes. His wife, Evelyn, a tall woman with sharp features and an air of quiet authority, sipped her drink and watched the crowd with a detached curiosity. Miss Marple, whose knack for drawing parallels between strangers and her village acquaintances was unmatched, thought Evelyn resembled Mrs. Babcock, the vicar's wife, composed, yet always seeming to know more than she let on. The conversation shifted as Canon Prescott, a genial clergyman with a round face and spectacles, joined Miss Marple's table, accompanied by his sister, Joan, a brisk woman whose energy seemed to organize the world around her. Such a delightful spot, isn't it? The canon said, gesturing at the sunset painting the sky in hues of coral and gold. Though I dare say Major Palgrave's stories add a certain color to the evening. Joan Prescott sniffed, adjusting her scarf. He does go on, doesn't he? All that talk of photographs and scandals. I'd rather he stuck to bridge. She glanced at Miss Marple, expecting agreement, but Miss Marple only smiled, her thoughts elsewhere. The Major's photograph, she mused, might be nothing a traveller's tall tale. Yet her instincts, honed by years of unraveling village intrigues, whispered otherwise as the stars began to speckle the sky. Major Palgrave rose, swaying slightly, and bid the group good night. Off to bed, he declared, his voice slurring. Just enough to draw a raised eyebrow from Joan. Big day tomorrow, got to show Miss Marple that snap. He chuckled and ambled toward his bungalow, his silhouette vanishing into the shadowed path lined with bougainvillea. Miss Marple lingered, her knitting folded neatly in her lap. The veranda was quieter now, the guests drifting to their rooms or the beachside bar. She watched Tim Kendall pause at Molly's side, his hand brushing hers in a gesture that seemed more calculated than affectionate. Molly's smile returned, but it was strained, like a mask slipped back into place. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her mind filing away the moment, as she did with all things that struck her as not quite right. Retiring to her own room, she paused at the window, gazing out at the moonlit gardens. The Golden Palms Hotel, for all its charm, had the faint undercurrent of something amisser, feeling she knew well from St. Mary Mead, where smiles often hid secrets. As she drew the curtains, Miss Marple thought of Major Palgrave's photograph, and his unsteady gait. Tomorrow, she murmured, settling into bed, will be most interesting. Chapter 2. A sudden death. The morning sun poured over the Golden Palms Hotel, gilding the whitewashed walls and casting dappled shadows through the palm fronds. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the open-air dining room, sipped her tea and nibbled a slice of papaya, her eyes half closed against the glare but keenly aware of the subdued hum around her. The usual chatter of breakfast, clinking cutlery, laughter, and the soft patter of waiters was muted, replaced by whispers and sidelong glances. Something had happened, and Miss Marple, with her knack for sensing the undercurrents of human behavior, felt the shift as keenly as a change in the weather. She had risen early, her rheumatism mercifully quiet, and taken her customary place near the edge of the dining room, where she could observe without being obtrusive. Her knitting lay folded in her lap, a prop as much as a pastime, allowing her to appear preoccupied, while her mind catalogued every detail. The previous evening's conversation with Major Palgrave lingered in her thoughts, his boast about the photograph, his flushed face, the slight slur in his voice as he bid her good night. She had intended to seek him out this morning, curious to see if his promised snap held any substance, or was merely another of his embellished tales. But now, as she buttered a piece of toast, she caught fragments of conversation from nearby. Tables, found him this morning. Heart, they say. Poor old fellow. Her needles, resting idle, twitched slightly. She leaned toward the Canon Prescott, who sat opposite her with a plate of scrambled eggs, his round face creased with concern. Canon, she said, her voice soft and slightly tremulous, as if she were merely a curious old lady, is something amiss? The guests seem rather unsettled. The Canon set down his fork glancing at his sister, Joan, who was buttering her toast with unnecessary vigor. "I'm afraid so, Miss Marple," he said, lowering his voice. "Major Palgrave, you—" "No, passed away in the night. Dr. Graham says it was his heart quite sudden, poor man." Joan Prescott looked up, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Hardly a surprise, if you ask me. The man drank like a fish and talked himself into a lather every evening. All those stories about jungles and murderers. His heart probably couldn't keep up." She returned to her toast, dismissing the matter with a flick of her wrist. Miss Marple's expression remained mild, but her mind was racing. Heart failure, was it? Convenient, perhaps, for someone. She recalled Palgrave's mention of the photographer murderer he'd said captured in a snapshot. Had he been about to reveal something dangerous? She sipped her tea, her gaze drifting to the far end of the dining room, where Tim Kendall, the hotel's manager, stood speaking to a cluster of guests. His boyish features were arranged in a mask of solemnity, but Miss Marple noted the quick, darting glances he cast about, as if gauging the mood of the room. Molly Kendall, his wife, moved among the tables, refilling coffee cups with a practiced smile. Her golden hair caught the sunlight, and her beauty drew admiring looks, but Miss Marple saw the strain in her posture, the way her hands trembled slightly as she poured. Something was troubling her, and Miss Marple, who had seen such signs in the young women of St. Mary Mead, suspected it was more than the shock of a guest's death. She turned back to the canon. "Did the Major seem unwell last night, do you think?" "I confess, I didn't notice anything untoward, but my eyes aren't what they used to be." Her tone was apologetic, inviting confidence, and the canon leaned forward, eager to share. "Well, now that you mention it," he said, "he was a bit red in the face, wasn't he?" Stumbling a little as he left the veranda. "I thought it was the rum punch. Those cocktails are stronger than they look. But Dr. Graham says he had a weak heart, been on pills for years. Found them by his bedside, apparently." Miss Marple nodded, her face a picture of innocent concern. "Pills, you say? How very sad. I suppose they didn't help in the end." Her mind, however, was elsewhere, piecing together the fragments. Pills could be tampered with, she knew, and a man like Palgrave, loud and indiscreet, might have made enemies. She thought of the photograph again, and a faint unease stirred within her. The dining room began to empty as guests drifted toward the beach or the lounge, their whispers trailing behind them. Miss Marple lingered, her tea cooling, and watched as Edward Hillingdon and his wife, Evelyn, passed by. Edward, his sketchbook tucked under his arm, looked distracted, his eyes fixed on some distant point. Evelyn, tall and composed, murmured something to him, and he nodded absently. Miss Marple noted the tension between them, subtle but unmistakable. Like a crack in a fine porcelain vase, she was about to rise when Tim Kendall approached her table, his smile polite but strained. "Miss Marple, I hope you're not too upset by the news," he said, his voice smooth but with an edge of urgency. "We're all a bit shaken, but Dr. Graham assures us it was natural. The Major was getting on, after all." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her eyes meeting his. "Such a shock, though. He seemed so lively last night, telling his stories. I was quite looking forward to seeing that photograph he mentioned." She watched him closely, noting the brief flicker in his expression surprise, or perhaps unease. "Photograph," Tim said, his tone casual. "Oh, you mean one of his old army snaps? He was always showing those off. Probably nothing special." He laughed, but it sounded forced, and he quickly changed the subject. "Can I get you more tea? Or perhaps you'd like to join the bridge game in the lounge later?" Miss Marple declined with a gentle smile, her mind already turning over his reaction. Why had the mention of the photograph unsettled him? She thanked him and watched as he moved away, pausing to speak to Molly, who was clearing a table nearby. Their exchange was brief, but Miss Marple saw Molly's shoulders stiffen, her smile faltering as Tim whispered something in her ear. Rising slowly, Miss Marple made her way to the lounge, a spacious room with ceiling fans and wicker furniture, where guests gathered to read or play cards. She settled into a chair near the window, her knitting resumed, and pretended to doze, her ears attuned to the conversations around her. Greg Dyson, an American with a loud laugh and a taste for flashy shirts, was holding forth to his wife, Lucky, a petite blonde with a sharp tongue and a penchant for flirting. "Heart attack, my foot," Greg was saying, his voice carrying, old. Palgrave was pickled in rum half the time. Bet he just keeled over from one too many. He chuckled, but Lucky shot him a look, her eyes darting toward Miss Marple's corner. "Don't be crude, Greg," she said, her voice low but sharp. "It's bad for business, talking like that. Tim's worried enough as it is." She adjusted her sunglasses and leaned back, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her face serene, but her mind was alert. Bad for business. An odd phrase, she thought, for a guest to use. And why was Tim Kendall worried? Unnatural. Death, even of a prominent guest, was hardly a scandal. Unless, of course, there was more to it. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Graham, a kindly man with a weathered face and a reassuring manner, who had been summoned to examine Palgrave's body. He entered the lounge, mopping his brow with a handkerchief, and was immediately surrounded by curious guests. Miss Marple, feigning a need to adjust her shawl, edged closer, catching his words. "Nothing to worry about," Dr. Graham was saying, his voice calm but firm. "Major Palgrave had a history of heart trouble. I prescribed his medication myself, digitalis, you know, for his condition. Found the bottle right by his bed, half empty. He must have had an attack in the night, poor fellow, and couldn't reach them in time." Joan Prescott, who had joined the group, nodded sagely. "Just as I said. Too much excitement, that's what did it. All those stories, working himself up." She glanced at Miss Marple, as if expecting agreement, but Miss Marple only murmured something vague, her mind elsewhere. Digitalis, she thought, a drug that, in the wrong dose, could be deadly. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, years ago, when a farmer's wife had accidentally given her husband too much of his heart. Medicine, the parallel was striking, and Miss Marple's unease deepened. She resolved to learn more about Palgrave's final hours, but discreetly. As was her way, as the morning wore on, she took a slow walk through the hotel gardens, her parasol shielding her from the sun. The paths were lined with hibiscus and frangipani, their scents heavy in the air, but Miss Marple's attention was on the bungalows, where guests were housed. Palgrave's was at the far end, a tidy structure with a small veranda. She paused nearby, ostensibly to admire a flowering shrub, and saw a maid, Victoria Johnson, emerging from the bungalow with a basket of linens. Victoria, a young woman with a bright smile and quick movements, nodded politely. "Morning, ma'am," she said, her accent lilting. "You looking for something?" "Oh, just enjoying the flowers," Miss Marple said, her tone airy. "Such a pity about Major Palgrave, isn't it? Were you the one who found him, my dear?" Victoria's smile faded, and she glanced round, as if to ensure they were alone. "Yes, ma'am," she said quietly. "This morning, when I went to clean, he was just lying there, all stiff, with his eyes open. Gave me a fright, I can tell you. But Dr. Graham came quick, said it was his heart." "How dreadful for you," Miss Marple said, her voice full of sympathy. "Did he seem ill when you saw him last? Or was everything quite normal?" Victoria hesitated, her fingers tightening on the basket. "He was fine yesterday, ma'am, far as I could tell, talking loud, like always. I saw him on his veranda, drinking with Mr. Kendall. Day was laughing, but—" She trailed off, her eyes flickering with something fear perhaps, or uncertainty. "But," Miss Marple prompted gently, her face all kindly concern. "Nothing, ma'am," Victoria said, quickly, her smile returning, though it was less convincing. "Just a shame, that's all." She bobbed her head and hurried off, leaving Miss Marple standing in the dappled shade, her mind worry. Laughing with Tim Kendall, she thought, and yet Tim had seemed so quick to dismiss Palgrave's photograph, so eager to assure everyone that death was natural. She recalled the strained look on Molly's face, the whispered exchange between husband and wife. Something was not right, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, felt the first stirrings of suspicion. She returned to the lounge, where a bridge game was forming, and took a seat near the window. Her knitting resumed. The room was abuzz with talk of Palgrave's death, but Miss Marple listened with only half an ear, her thoughts elsewhere. She watched as Tim Kendall entered, his smile back in place, and began organizing a group for a boat trip, his voice cheerful, but his eyes restless. Molly was nowhere to be seen, and Miss Marple wondered where she had gone, and why, as the afternoon heat settled over the hotel, Miss Marple retired to her room, ostensibly for a nap, but in truth to think. She sat by the window, her knitting idle, and gazed out at the shimmering sea. Major Palgrave's death, she mused, might be exactly what it seemed, sad but natural end. Yet the photograph, the pills, the Kendalls, unease, and Victoria's hesitation suggested otherwise. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a sudden death had once revealed a web of deceit, and her lips curved in a faint, determined smile. "People are the same everywhere," she murmured, her eyes bright with purpose, "and secrets, like weeds, have a way of coming to light." Chapter 3. The photograph the morning after Major Palgrave's death. The Golden Palms Hotel wore a veneer of normalcy, like a well-rehearsed play masking backstage tensions. The sun blazed over Estiona, gilding the turquoise sea and coaxing vibrant blooms from the hibiscus hedges, yet an undercurrent of unease lingered among the guests. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the shade of the dining room's veranda, sipped her morning tea, her frail hands folded over her knitting, which lay untouched in her lap. Her pale blue eyes, sharp despite her delicate appearance, roamed the room, noting every glance, every whisper. The Major's sudden death had stirred the hotel like a stone dropped into a still pond, and Miss Marple, with her village-honed instincts, sensed ripples that others missed. She had slept lightly, her mind turning over the events of the previous day, Palgrave's boast about his photograph of a murderer, his flushed face as he stumbled to bed, Tim Kendall's unease when she mentioned the snapshot, and Victoria Johnson's hesitant words about seeing the Major with the hotel manager. The official verdict, heart failure, confirmed by Dr. Graham's examinations, seemed tidy, but Miss Marple knew that tidy explanations often concealed untidy truths. In St. Mary Mead, she had unravelled many a natural death to reveal motives as old as human nature: greed, fear, or love twisted into something darker. The dining room buzzed with subdued chatter. Guests helped themselves to platters of mango, papaya, and freshly baked rolls. Their voices lowered out of respect for the deceased, though curiosity sharpened their tones. At a nearby table, Canon Prescott and his sister, Joan, discussed the Major's passing with the brisk efficiency of those accustomed to organizing life's messier moments. The Canon, his spectacles glinting in the sunlight, spread marmalade on his toast with care. "Poor Palgrave," he said, shaking his head, "always full of stories. I suppose that photograph he was so fond of will go to his family now, if he had any. He mentioned it to me once. Scandal from his army days, he claimed." Joan, her lips pursed, set down her coffee cup. "Nonsense, Jeremy. The man loved to dramatize. Probably just a blurry snapshot of some old chum, not a murderer. He had a flair for exaggeration, like that tiger hunting tale he told twice a week." She glanced at Miss Marple, seeking agreement, but Miss Marple's expression remained vague, her eyes drifting to the far end of the room. "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, her voice soft and slightly quavering, as if she were merely a kindly old lady indulging in idle chat. "But it's curious, isn't it, how certain stories stick in one's mind. I do wish I'd seen that photograph. Major Palgrave seemed so eager to share it." She paused, her gaze settling on the Canon, who nodded thoughtfully. "He did, didn't he?" the Canon said. "Kept patting that wallet of his, saying it was proof of something. I assumed it was one of his yarns, but now I wonder." He trailed off, distracted by a waiter offering more coffee. Miss Marple's needles twitched in her lap, though she did not pick them up. Proof, she thought. A dangerous word, if the photograph truly held a secret worth hiding. She recalled Palgrave's words on the veranda, his hint that the snapshot showed a murderer he'd once known. Had he recognized someone at the hotel, someone who could not afford to be exposed? Her mind, agile despite her years, began to weave a pattern from the threads of the past 2 days. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Tim Kendall, who moved through the dining room with the ease of a man born to charm. His boyish smile was firmly in place, but Miss Marple noted the faint lines of tension around his eyes, the way his hands fidgeted with a napkin as he spoke to guests. He paused at her table, his manner solicitous. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice warm but with a trace of strain. "I hope you slept well, despite yesterday's sad news. We're planning a little excursion to the reef this afternoon, if you'd care to join us." "How kind," Miss Marple said, her smile gentle. "I'm afraid my sightseeing days are rather behind me, but I do appreciate the offer. Tell me, Mr. Kendall, have Major Palgrave's belongings been sorted yet? I seem to recall lending him a book, a little mystery novel I brought from home. I'd hate for it to be misplaced." Tim's smile faltered, so briefly that only someone as observant as Miss Marple would have noticed. "A book," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "I'm sure we can check, but the police took charge of his things, you know, just routine. Dr. Graham handled most of it, and the room's been cleared for the next guest. I'll ask around, though." He nodded, his eyes sliding away from hers, and moved on to another table. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her face serene but her mind alert. Cleared already, she thought. That was quick, even for a small hotel. And Tim's reaction, his slight hesitation, the way he avoided her gaze, suggested he was hiding something. She recalled Victoria's words about seeing Tim laughing with Palgrave the night before his death. What had they discussed, and why was Tim so eager to dismiss the photograph as insignificant? The dining room began to empty, and Miss Marple rose, her parasol in hand, intending to take a slow walk through the gardens. As she passed the lounge, she saw Molly Kendall arranging flowers in a vase, her movements jerky, her usual radiance dimmed. Molly's golden hair was slightly dishevelled, and her hands trembled as she snipped a stem too short, muttering under her breath. Miss Marple paused, her expression one of kindly concern. "Good morning, Mrs. Kendall," she said, her voice soft. "Those flowers are lovely. You have quite a talent for arranging them." Molly started, nearly dropping her scissors. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, forcing a smile. "Thank you, I'm just a bit distracted today. All this business with Major Palgrave, you know. It's upsetting." She brushed a strand of hair from her face, her eyes darting toward the dining room, where Tim was still circulating. "Quite understandable," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic. "Such a shock for everyone. I was just speaking to your husband about a book I lent the Major. I don't suppose you noticed any of his things lying about. He mentioned a photograph, too, that sounded rather intriguing." Molly's smile froze, and for a moment her fingers tightened on the vase. "A photograph," she said, her voice a touch too high. "No, I wouldn't know anything about that. Tim handles all the guest matters. I'm sure it's with the police, if it's important." She turned back to the flowers, her movements abrupt, and Miss Marple, sensing her discomfort, murmured a polite farewell and continued on her way. The gardens were a riot of colour, with bougainvillea spilling over trellises and the scent of frangipani heavy in the air. Miss Marple walked slowly, her parasol shielding her from the sun, her mind piecing together the morning's observations. Tim's unease, Molly's nervousness, and the canon's mention of the photograph as proof all pointed to a secret that Palgrave's death had not quite buried. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a lost letter or a misplaced trinket had often unravelled a carefully constructed lie, and resolved to learn more about the Major's final hours. Her walk took her past the bungalows, where she saw Victoria Johnson sweeping the veranda of a nearby unit. The maid's bright smile returned as she waved, but Miss Marple noted a wariness in her eyes, as if she were on guard. Approaching with her usual air of harmless curiosity, Miss Marple paused to admire the view. "Such a lovely spot, Victoria," she said, her voice warm. "You must see all sorts of things working here. I was just thinking about poor Major Palgrave. Did he ever show you that photograph he was so fond of? He seemed to think it was quite special." Victoria's broom slowed, and she glanced round, her expression guarded. "No, ma'am," she said, her voice low. "He talked about it sometimes, said it was from some old case, but I never saw it. He kept it in his wallet, mostly." She hesitated, then added, "He was always chatting with Mr. Kendall, you know. They'd sit on his veranda, drinking and laughing. I saw them the night he... Well, you know." Miss Marple nodded, her face all sympathy. "Yes, such a pity. And nothing seemed amiss that night. No visitors, or anything out of the ordinary." Victoria's eyes flickered, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might say more, but the maid shook her head, her smile returning like a curtain drawn across a stage. "No, ma'am, nothing like that. Just the usual. I'd better get back to work now." She turned away, her broom moving briskly, and Miss Marple let her go, her mind filing away the maid's hesitation. Returning to the lounge, Miss Marple settled into a wicker chair near the window, her knitting resumed as a shield for her thoughts. The room was lively, with guests playing cards or reading newspapers. but the air was thick with unspoken questions about Palgrave's death. She watched as Edward Hillingdon entered, his sketchbook under his arm, and took a seat near his wife, Evelyn, who was reading a botanical journal. Their interaction was polite but distant, like two actors playing a familiar scene with no real warmth. Miss Marple, who had seen such dynamics in her village, wondered what lay beneath their reserve. Her attention shifted to Greg Dyson and his wife, Lucky, who were arguing in low tones at a corner table. Greg's loud voice carried, despite his efforts to keep it down. "I'm telling you, Lucky, Tim's up to something. He was cagey when I asked about the accounts, and now Palgrave's gone. Convenient, if you ask me." Lucky rolled her eyes, her voice sharp. "Don't be ridiculous, Greg. You're just sore because you lost at poker again. Tim's running a hotel, not a conspiracy. Let it go." She caught Miss Marple's glance and flashed a quick smile, as if to dismiss the tension. But Miss Marple noted the unease in her posture, the way her fingers toyed with her necklace. The afternoon passed quietly, with Miss Marple joining a bridge game organized by Joan Prescott, though her mind was only half on the cards. She listened to the gossip, sifting through the chatter for clues. One guest, a retired banker, mentioned Palgrave's habit of carrying his wallet everywhere, even to the beach. Another recalled his loud laughter the night before his death, as he sat with Tim Kendall on his veranda. Miss Marple filed each detail. Away, her thoughts circling back to the photograph. As evening approached, she took a light supper in the dining room, her eyes on Tim and Molly, who moved among the guests with practiced ease. Yet Molly's smile was strained, and Tim's laughter sounded forced. When a glass slipped from Molly's hand, shattering on the floor, the room fell silent for a moment, and Miss Marple saw Tim's face tighten, his hand gripping his wife's arm briefly before he covered it with a laugh. "Clumsy me," Molly said, her voice bright but brittle, and the moment passed. But Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, knew that something was deeply wrong. The photograph, she thought, was the key. If only she could find it or learn why it had vanished so quickly. As she retired to her room, the moon casting silver light over the gardens, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting idle. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a single misplaced item a letter, a key had often unlocked a hidden truth. The Golden Palms Hotel, for all its tropical charm, was no different. People were people, and secrets, like shadows, grew longer in the light of suspicion. Chapter 4. The Second Tragedy, the Golden Palms Hotel. Bathed in the relentless Caribbean sun, seemed to shimmer with an uneasy calm 2 days after Major Palgrave's death. The guests, determined to reclaim their holiday spirit, lounged by the pool or strolled the beach, their laughter a touch too loud, as if to drown out the lingering shadow of loss. Miss Jane Marple, however, sat in the shade of the veranda, her knitting a soft rhythm in her lap, her pale blue eyes missing nothing. The Major's death, officially attributed to heart failure, had not settled in her mind. The missing photograph, Tim Kendall's evasive demeanor, Molly's trembling hands, and Victoria Johnson's hesitant words wove a pattern that Miss Marple, with her St. Mary Mead instincts, could not ignore. Human nature, she knew, was as predictable as the tides, and secrets, like driftwood, had a way of washing ashore. Her morning had begun with a quiet breakfast, where she listened to the subdued chatter of the guests. Canon Prescott and his sister, Joan, discussed a memorial service for Palgrave, while Edward and Evelyn Hillingdon, seated nearby, exchanged few words, their silence more telling than any conversation. Miss Marple noted Greg Dyson's absence from the dining room, though his wife, Lucky, flitted about, her sharp laugh cutting through the murmurs. Tim Kendall moved among the tables, his charm polished but strained, while Molly, pale beneath her golden tan, avoided meeting anyone's gaze. The hotel, Miss Marple thought, was a stage, and its players were hiding their true roles. She was sipping her second cup of tea when a piercing scream shattered the morning's calm. It came from the direction of the beach, sharp and raw, cutting through the hum of cicadas and the distant crash of waves. The dining room froze, forks suspended, eyes wide. Tim Kendall, standing near the buffet, dropped a tray of croissants, his face pallid. Before anyone could speak, Victoria Johnson, the maid, stumbled into view, her bright uniform askew, her eyes wild with panic. "It's Victoria," a waiter shouted, rushing toward her. But Victoria collapsed before he reached her, her body crumpling onto the sandy path just beyond the veranda. Miss Marple, her knitting forgotten, rose slowly, her heart quickening but her mind clear. The guests surged forward, a chaotic mix of concern and curiosity, but Miss Marple hung back, her eyes scanning the scene. Dr. Graham, summoned from his nearby cottage, pushed through the crowd, his medical bag in hand. He knelt beside Victoria, his weathered face grim as he checked her pulse, then shook his head. "She's gone," he said, his voice low but carrying in the sudden silence. A murmur rippled through the onlookers, and Miss Marple caught fragments of their shock. Poison, voodoo, not another death. Tim Kendall, recovering his composure, took charge, his voice firm. "Everyone, please, back to the dining room. Let Dr. Graham and the police handle this. There's no need to panic." He gestured to the staff, who began herding guests away, but Miss Marple lingered, her parasol shielding her from the sun, her gaze fixed on Victoria's still form. The maid's face, frozen in a rictus of pain, told a story of sudden, violent death, and Miss Marple's thoughts raced to the implications. She approached Dr. Graham as he rose, wiping his hands on a handkerchief. "Such a dreadful thing," she said, her voice quavering with the fragility she often used to disarm. "Poor girl, do you know what happened, Doctor? She seemed so lively only yesterday." Dr. Graham sighed, his eyes tired. "Poison, I'm afraid. A rare plant extracts something like curare, though I'll need tests to confirm. It's quick, paralyzing the muscles. She must have ingested it just minutes ago." He glanced at the crowd, lowering his voice. "The locals will talk of voodoo, but this is chemistry, not magic. I've seen it before, in my years here." Miss Marple nodded, her face all sympathy, but her mind seized on the word plant. Poison from a rare plant suggested knowledge, perhaps specialized knowledge, and she thought of Evelyn Hillingdon, whose botanical expertise was no secret. "How terrible," she murmured, "and so soon after Major Palgrave. Do you think, could there be a connection?" Dr. Graham hesitated, his brow furrowing. "I doubt it, Miss Marple. Palgrave's was a heart attack, natural enough for a man his age. This is different, but I'll inform Inspector Daventry. He'll want to investigate." He turned away, signaling to a staff member, and Miss Marple stepped back, her thoughts whirling. The guests, now huddled in the lounge, buzzed with speculation. Joan Prescott, her voice sharp, declared it utterly barbaric, blaming the islands. Superstitions. The canon, more subdued, suggested a prayer for Victoria's soul. Miss Marple, settling into a wicker chair, listened. Her knitting resumed as a shield for her observations. She noted Evelyn Hillingdon's stillness, her hands folded tightly. In her lap, and Edward's distracted sketching, his pencil moving furiously across a page. Greg Dyson, reappearing with a flushed face, muttered about bad luck, while Lucky's eyes darted nervously, as if expecting trouble. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Victoria's words the previous day, her mention of seeing Palgrave, laughing with Tim Kendall, her hesitation when asked about anything unusual. Had Victoria known something dangerous, something tied to the Major's death or his photograph? Miss Marple recalled the maid's excitement, her hint of having seen something odd in a guest's room. The poison, so specific and rare, suggested a calculated act, not a random tragedy. And Miss Marple's suspicions deepened. She rose, her movements slow, and approached Tim Kendall, who was speaking with a police officer near the lounge entrance. "Mr. Kendall," she said, her voice gentle, "I'm so sorry about Victoria. She was such a kind girl. I don't suppose you know if she mentioned anything unusual recently. She seemed a bit preoccupied when I spoke to her." Tim's smile was tight, his eyes flickering to the officer before returning to her. "Unusual? No, Miss Marple, nothing like that. Victoria was always cheerful, chatting with everyone. This is just a terrible accident. The police will sort it out." He excused himself, his haste betraying his discomfort, and Miss Marple watched him go, her mind noting his reluctance to engage. The afternoon brought Inspector Daventry, a lean man with a clipped moustache and a nonsense air, who arrived with 2 constables to question the staff and guests. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the lounge, overheard snippets of his interviews, conducted in a corner of the room. The staff reported nothing out of the ordinary, though one waiter mentioned Victoria's recent excitement, as if she'd discovered something important. The guests, for their part, were eager to distance themselves, claiming no knowledge of the maid beyond her cheerful service. Miss Marple, feigning a need for fresh air, took a slow walk to the beach, her parasol a shield against both sun and scrutiny. The spot where Victoria had collapsed was cordoned off, a constable standing guard, but Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the nearby foliage dense, shrubs and flowering plants that could conceal a multitude of secrets. She thought of Evelyn Hillingdon's botanical knowledge, her reserved demeanour, and wondered if the poison had come from these very gardens. A memory from St. Mary Mead surfaced, a gardener's wife who had used foxglove to deadly effect. Miss Marple's lips tightened. Returning to the hotel, she sought out Evelyn Hillingdon, who was seated in the garden, reading a journal on tropical flora. "Mrs. Hillingdon," Miss Marple said, settling beside her, "I was just admiring the plants here. You must find them fascinating, with your expertise. Are there many dangerous ones, do you think?" Evelyn's eyes flickered, but her voice was calm. "Oh, a few," she said, closing her journal. "Some have toxins used in small doses for medicine, but deadly if mishandled. It's rare, though, for anyone to misuse them." She smiled, but it was thin, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands. "How interesting," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "I suppose it takes great skill to handle such things safely. Poor Victoriashi must have stumbled across something by accident." She watched Evelyn closely, but the woman's expression remained guarded, and she soon excused herself, claiming a headache. The day wore on, with the hotel settling into an uneasy routine. Miss Marple joined a bridge game in the lounge, her mind only half on the cards as she listened to the guests' chatter. Greg Dyson, His voice, loud with rum, speculated about curses on the island, while Lucky shushed him, her eyes darting. To Tim, who was organizing a sunset cruise to distract the guests. Molly, serving drinks, moved like a ghost, her beauty dimmed by exhaustion or fear. Miss Marple, playing her cards with absent precision, thought of the photograph again. Had Victoria seen it, or something related, in a guest's room, and who had silenced her so ruthlessly? As evening fell, Miss Marple lingered in the lounge, her knitting a quiet rhythm. She overheard Tim arguing with Greg Dyson near the bar, their voices low but heated. "You owe me, Greg," Tim said, his tone sharp. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Greg muttered something inaudible, and Tim walked away, his face dark. Molly, watching from a distance, turned away. Her hands clenched. Miss Marple retired to her room, her thoughts a tangle of clues. Victoria's death, so soon after Palgrave's, was no coincidence. The poison, the photograph, Tim's agitation, and Molly's distress all pointed to a hidden truth, one that someone was desperate to keep buried. She sat by her window, the moon casting silver light over the gardens, and thought of St. Mary Mead, where a second death had once unmasked a killer's fear of exposure. "To deaths," she murmured, her eyes bright with purpose, "and a secret that binds them." Chapter 5. Miss Marple's Suspicions. The Golden Palms Hotel, its whitewashed walls aglow under the Caribbean sun, wore a fragile mask of tranquility 3 days after Major Palgrave's death and 1 day after the shocking loss of Victoria Johnson. The guests, determined to salvage their holiday, sipped cocktails by the pool or wandered the beach, but their laughter rang hollow, like bells in a fog. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a shaded corner of the hotel's lounge, her knitting a soft whisper in her lap, observed the scene with her usual deceptive mildness. Her pale blue eyes, sharp as a hawk's, missed nothing. The forced smiles, the furtive glances, the unspoken questions that hung in the air like humidity. 2 deaths in so short a time were no coincidence, and Miss Marple, with her St. Mary, meat-honed instincts, felt the threads of a darker pattern tightening. Her morning had been spent in quiet observation, sifting through the clues that had accumulated like pebbles in a stream. Major Palgrave's heart attack, so conveniently explained by his digitalis pills, his missing photograph, which he'd claimed showed a murderer, Tim Kendall's evasive responses and Molly's nervous tremors, Victoria's poisoning by a rare plant extract, her hint of seeing something odd in a guest's room. Each piece, alone, might mean nothing, but together they formed a picture that Miss Marple could not dismiss. She thought of her village, where a sudden death or a whispered secret had often unraveled a web of deceit, and resolved to probe deeper, with the gentle persistence that had so often disarmed the guilty. The lounge, with its ceiling fans stirring, the warm air, was a hub of subdued activity. Guests played cards or read novels, their voices low, as if wary of disturbing the delicate balance of the hotel's routine. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, pretended to doze, her shawl draped loosely over her shoulders. It was a pose she had perfected over the years, allowing her to listen while appearing harmless, a frail old lady easily overlooked. Yet her mind was anything but idle, cataloguing every word, every gesture at a nearby table. Canon Prescott and his sister, Joan, discussed the latest developments with their usual blend of piety and pragmatism. The Canon, his round face creased with concern, adjusted his spectacles. "Poor Victoria," he said, shaking his head. Such a bright girl. Inspector Daventry seems thorough, but I fear this talk of poison will unsettle everyone. First Palgrave. Now this sits almost as if the hotel is cursed. Joan snorted, her brisk manner undeterred. Cursed? Nonsense, Jeremy. Palgrave was an old drunk with a bad heart, and Victoria probably ate something she shouldn't have. These islands are full of strange plants. People need to stop gossiping and let the police do their work. She glanced at Miss Marple, expecting agreement, but Miss Marple's eyes remained half-closed, her face serene. Perhaps. Miss Marple murmured, her voice quavering slightly, as if roused from a nap. But it's curious, isn't it, how quickly things have happened. Major Palgrave was so full of life, with his stories and that photograph he mentioned, and Victoria Shea seemed so cheerful, yet troubled, I thought, when I spoke to her. She let the words hang, watching the Canon's reaction. The Canon nodded thoughtfully, troubled. Well, now you mention it, she did seem a bit distracted the last time I saw her. Kept looking over her shoulder, as if expecting someone. And Palgravius, he was always on about that photograph. Said it was from a case he'd worked on, something about a fraud or a murder. I didn't pay much attention, but he seemed to think it was important. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind seizing on the word fraud. A new piece of the puzzle, perhaps. She recalled Palgrave's boast on the veranda, his claim that the snapshot showed a murderer. But fraud suggested a different kind of crime, one tied to money, perhaps, or deception. She thought of Tim Kendall, whose charm masked a restless energy, and wondered if the hotel's finances were as sunny as its facade. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Lucky Dyson, who flounced into the lounge with a glass of rum. Punch, her blonde hair catching the light. She settled at a table with Evelyn Hillingdon, who was sketching a leaf with meticulous care, her sharp features softened by concentration. Lucky's voice, bright and a touch too loud, cut through the room's murmur. Honestly, Evelyn, this place is turning into a morgue, Lucky said, tossing her hair. First that old bore Palgrave, now the maid. I told Greg we should have gone to Barbados instead. At least there's no poison floating around there. She laughed, but it was brittle, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes darted to the door, as if expecting trouble. Evelyn's pencil paused, and she looked up, her expression cool. It's tragic, of course, but hardly a reason to leave. The police are handling it. These things happen, especially in places where people aren't careful with what they touch or eat. Her tone was measured, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in her eyes, quickly masked Miss Marple, feigning a need to adjust her shawl, leaned slightly closer, her voice soft. Such a pity about Victoria, she said, addressing Lucky. She was so helpful, always chatting with everyone. I don't suppose she mentioned anything to you, Mrs. Dyson. She seemed a bit worried the last time I saw her. Lucky's smile faltered, and she took a quick sip of her drink. Worried. Not that I noticed. She was always giggling, running around with trays, though she hesitated, then shrugged. She did say something odd the other day, about Molly Kendall being upset after Palgrave died. Kept going on about how Molly was not herself. I thought it was just servant gossip. She laughed again, but it was forced, and Miss Marple filed the information away. The mention of Molly sharpened her focus. She recalled the young woman's strained smile, her trembling hands, the way Tim had whispered to her in the dining room. Was Molly's distress simply grief, or something deeper? Miss Marple thought of St. Mary Mead, where a young wife's nervous glances had once betrayed a husband's infidelity and a murder. She resolved to speak with Molly, but carefully, as one might approach a skittish bird. As the afternoon heat deepened, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the hotel gardens, her parasol a shield against the sun. The paths wound past bougainvillea and oleander, their vibrant colours belying the danger of their toxins, and she thought of Victoria's poisoning. A rare plant extract, Dr. Graham had said curare or something similar. Such a poison required knowledge, perhaps access to the very gardens she now strolled. She glanced at the Hillingdons' bungalow, where Edward was visible through a window, bent over a table strewn with botanical specimens. Evelyn, she knew, shared his expertise, and Miss Marple wondered if their quiet reserve hid a more sinister secret. Her walk took her near the staff quarters, where she saw a group of maids whispering, their faces drawn. One, a young woman with Victoria's bright smile, caught Miss Marple's eye and nodded politely. Miss Marple paused, her expression kindly. "Such a sad loss. Your friend, Victoria," she said, her voice warm. "I don't suppose she mentioned anything troubling her. She was so lively, it's hard to believe she's gone." The maid, whose name tag read Esther, hesitated, glancing at her companions. "She was lively, ma'am," she said softly, "but the last day or two, she was different. Kept saying she'd seen something in one of the rooms, something that wasn't right. Wouldn't tell me what, just said it was big. I told her to talk to Mr. Kendall, but she didn't want to." Esther's voice dropped, and she looked away as if regretting her words. Miss Marple nodded, her face all sympathy. "Thank you, my dear. It's so hard to lose someone so young." She moved on, her mind racing. Something in a room perhaps, the photograph, or something related to Palgrave's death. Victoria's excitement, her sudden death, suggested she had stumbled onto a secret too dangerous to keep. Miss Marple thought of Tim Kendall's quick dismissal of the photograph, his insistence that Palgrave's room had been cleared, and her suspicions deepened. Back in the lounge, she joined a bridge game organised by Joan Prescott, using the opportunity to observe the guests more closely. Greg Dyson, his face flushed with drink, was absent, but Lucky played with a restless energy, her eyes flicking to the door whenever Tim Kendall passed by. Evelyn Hillingdon, partnered with the Canon, played with quiet precision, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened on her cards, as if bracing for an unseen blow. Edward, sketching in a corner, seemed oblivious, his pencil moving in sharp, jerky strokes. During a break, Miss Marple approached Molly Kendall, who was clearing teacups from a side table. "Mrs. Kendall," she said, her voice gentle, "I do hope you're managing, with all this sadness. Victoria was so fond of you, I could tell. Did she ever confide in you, do you think? She seemed so unsettled before the end." Molly's hands froze, and a cup rattled against its saucer. "Confide," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, Miss Marple, she didn't. She was always busy, you know, running around. I didn't notice anything wrong." Her eyes, wide and shadowed, met Miss Marple's for a moment, then darted away, and she hurried off. Her steps unsteady, Miss Marple returned to her seat, her mind piecing together the fragments. Molly's fear, Victoria's hint of a discovery. The poison's botanical original pointed to a conspiracy, one that Palgrave's photograph might have threatened to expose. She thought of Tim Kendall, whose charm seemed a mask for something darker, and wondered if his whispered exchanges with Molly held the key. As evening fell, the hotel prepared for a dance, a desperate attempt to restore normalcy. Miss Marple, declining to join, sat on the veranda, her knitting a quiet companion. The music drifted out, a lively calypso beat, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a second death had revealed a killer's desperation to silence a witness. Victoria, she suspected, had been that witness, and her death was a warning to others. But who was the killer protecting, and what secret was worth such bloodshed? The stars emerged, silver against the velvet sky, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind as clear as the night. 2 deaths, she murmured, her needles still, and a truth that someone will kill to hide. Chapter 6. A midnight encounter, the Golden Palms Hotel. Its whitewashed walls, silvered by moonlight, lay quiet under the Caribbean stars. But the stillness was deceptive, like the calm before a storm. 4 days had passed since Major Palgrave's death, and 2 since Victoria Johnson's poisoning, and the hotel's guests, though clinging to their holiday routines, moved with the wariness of actors in a play they no longer trusted. Miss Jane Marple, her frail frame wrapped in a lacy shawl, sat by her bungalow's window, her knitting idle, her pale blue eyes fixed on the shadowed gardens. Sleep eluded her, not from the heat or her rheumatism, but from the puzzle that grew more intricate with each passing day. The Major's photograph, Victoria's cryptic hints, Tim Kendall's evasions, Molly's fear, and the poison's botanical precision wove a web that Miss Marple, with her St. Mary Mead instincts, was determined to untangle. Her day had been one of quiet probing, her gentle questions and feigned absent-mindedness yielding fragments of truth. The canon's mention of Palgrave's photograph as proof of a fraud, Lucky Dyson's slip about Molly's distress, Esther's revelation of Victoria's discovery in a guest's room, and Evelyn Hillingdon's guarded response about toxic plants had all sharpened her suspicions. 2 deaths, so close together, were no accident, and Miss Marple felt the weight of a hidden motive, greed, perhaps, or fear of exposure. She thought of her village, where a whispered rumour or a misplaced glance had often betrayed a killer, and knew that patience, not haste, would reveal the truth. Yet patience did not mean inaction. The hotel's tense atmosphere, like a kettle on the verge of boiling, suggested that the killer might act again, and Miss Marple resolved to be vigilant. Unable to sleep, she rose, slipping on her shawl and soft-soled shoes, and stepped onto her bungalow's veranda. The night was warm, the air heavy with the scent of jasmine and the distant rhythm of waves. The gardens, bathed in moonlight, were a maze of shadows, and Miss Marple, her steps slow but deliberate, ventured into them, her parasol left behind but her senses alert. She had no clear plan, only a sense that the night might reveal what the day concealed. Her walks in St. Mary Mead had often uncovered secrets light in a window, a hushed conversation, and she trusted her instincts to guide her now. The hotel grounds were deserted, the guests asleep or lingering at the bar, where a late-night band played softly. Miss Marple moved silently, her slight figure blending with the shadows, her eyes scanning the bungalows and paths. As she neared the hibiscus hedge that bordered the staff cottages, a faint rustle caught her attention. She paused, her heart quickening, but her expression calm, and peered through the foliage. A figure emerged from the shadows, Tim Kendall, his boyish features taut, his movements furtive. He wore a dark shirt, unusual for the hotel's manager, and his hands were busy, slipping a small vial into his pocket. Miss Marple's breath caught, but she remained still, her years of discretion serving her well. Tim glanced around, his eyes sweeping the darkness, and Miss Marple shrank back, grateful for the hedge's cover. Moments later, another figure appeared, Marley Kendall, stepping from their cottage, her golden hair loose, her face pale in the moonlight. She wore a light robe, and her steps were hesitant, as if drawn against her will. "Tim," she whispered, her voice trembling, "what are you doing out here? It's late." Tim turned, his expression softening, but Miss Marple noted the calculation in his eyes. "Just checking the grounds, darling," he said, his voice low and soothing. "Couldn't sleep with all that's happened. Go back to bed, you need rest." He reached for her, but Molly flinched, her hands twisting together. "I can't rest," she said, her voice breaking. "Not after Victoria and everything else." "Tim, what's happening? You're different, and she stopped, her eyes searching his face, and Miss Marple, hidden, felt a pang of sympathy. Molly's fear was palpable, like that of a young wife in St. Mary Mead who had discovered her husband's betrayal. Tim's smile was strained, but he pulled her close, his voice a murmur. "You're imagining things, Molly. It's just the shock. We'll get through this, I promise. No one will find out." He kissed her forehead, and Molly nodded, her shoulders slumping. But her eyes remained haunted as she turned back to the cottage. Miss Marple's mind raced. "No one will find out." The words echoed, heavy with implication. Find out what? A secret tied to Palgrave's death, or Victoria's? The vial in Tim's pocket, was it poison, or something innocuous? She thought of Dr. Graham's description, of the plant extract that killed Victoria, and her suspicions deepened. Tim's late-night prowling, his whispered reassurance, suggested a man with something to hide, and Miss Marple resolved to watch him closely as Tim moved toward the main hotel. Miss Marple waited, her heart steady despite the risk. She was about to retreat when a flicker of movement caught her eye. Another figure, watching from a balcony above. Edward Hillingdon, his sketchbook forgotten, stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the spot where Tim had been. The moonlight caught his face, revealing a look of intense focus, and Miss Marple wondered what he had seen or suspected. Edward's quiet demeanour, his absorption in his botanical work, had marked him as unremarkable, but now she saw him differently, a man who observed more than he revealed. She slipped back to her bungalow, her steps silent, and locked the door. Behind her, sitting by the window, her knitting untouched, she pieced together the night's revelations. Tim's vial, Molly's fear, Edward's silent vigil all pointed to a conspiracy, one that Palgrave's photograph might have threatened to expose. She recalled the canon's mention of a fraud case, Victoria's hint of a discovery in a guest's room, and Lucky's comment about Molly's distress. The threads were converging, but the pattern remained incomplete. The next morning, Miss Marple joined the guests for breakfast, her demeanour as mild as ever. The dining room buzzed with talk of Victoria's death, the poison now confirmed as a rare alkaloid derived from a local shrub. Inspector Daventry, present to update the guests, spoke of ongoing inquiries but offered no suspects, his clipped tone discouraging questions. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, noted Tim's absence from the room, though Molly moved among the tables, her smile brittle, her hands unsteady as she poured coffee. She turned to Dr. Graham, who sat nearby, his face weary from the strain of recent events. "Doctor," she said, her voice soft and slightly tremulous, "I've been thinking about poor Major Palgrave. You mentioned his heart medication, digitalis, wasn't it? I knew a gentleman in my village who took it, but his wife was terribly careful with the doses. Could such a drug be misused, do you think?" Dr. Graham frowned, his eyes narrowing. Misused? Well, yes, in theory. Digitalis is a powerful drug. Too much can cause a heart attack, not prevent one. But Palgrave's bottle was in order, and he'd been taking it for years. I checked the dosage myself when I prescribed it. He paused, then added, "Why do you ask, Miss Marple? You seem very curious about these matters." Miss Marple smiled, her expression vague. "Oh, just an old lady's fancy, Doctor. One hears such stories, you know." But her mind was sharp, filing away his words. Digitalis, if tampered with, could explain Palgrave's sudden death, and Tim's access to the Major's bungalow, laughing with him the night he died, as Victoria had said, made him a plausible suspect. The vial she had seen last night loomed larger in her thoughts. The morning passed in a haze of heat, with guests retreating to the pool or the lounge. Miss Marple, feigning a need for rest, lingered in the gardens, her parasol a shield as she watched the bungalows. She saw Edward Hillingdon emerge from his, carrying a satchel of plant samples, his face distracted but purposeful. Evelyn, joining him, spoke briefly, her words inaudible but her tone sharp. Miss Marple wondered if their botanical expertise extended to the poison that killed Victoria, or if Edward's balcony vigil hinted at a different role, observer, perhaps, or accomplice, at lunch. She sat with Lucky Dyson, whose chatter was a goldmine of careless revelations. "This place is giving me the creeps," Lucky said, picking at her salad. "Greg's in a foul mood. Says Tim's been dodging him about some money thing. And Molly, honest to God, she looks like she's seen a ghost. I saw her crying by the pool yesterday, but when I asked, she just ran off." Lucky's eyes flicked to Miss Marple, then away, as if regretting her candor. "How distressing," Miss Marple said, her voice all sympathy. "Mrs. Kendall does seem fragile. I suppose the recent tragedies have taken a toll. Did Victoria ever mention anything about her, do you think? Servants notice so much, don't they?" Lucky shrugged, her necklace glinting. "Not really. Victoria was always giggling, but she did say once that Molly was scared of something. I thought she meant the hotel's troubles, but who knows? Anyway, I'm ready to leave this place." She laughed, but it was thin, and Miss Marple noted the nervous twitch of her fingers. The afternoon brought a bridge game, where Miss Marple played with her usual absent-minded skill, her mind elsewhere. She watched Tim Kendall, now back in the lounge, organizing a snorkeling trip with forced cheer. Molly, serving tea, avoided his gaze, her movements mechanical. Miss Marple thought of the midnight encounter, Tim's whispered promise that no one will find out, and felt a chill despite the heat. What was he hiding, and how far would he go to protect it? As evening approached, she spoke briefly with Inspector Daventry, who was interviewing staff in the lounge. "Inspector," she said, her voice quavering, "I do hope you're making progress. Poor Victoria's such a shock. I don't suppose she left any notes or mentioned anything to her friends. She seemed so observant." Daventry's mustache twitched, his eyes appraising. "Nothing concrete, Miss Marple, but we're looking into her movements. She was seen near the guest bungalows the morning she died, possibly cleaning. If she saw something, she didn't write it down." He paused, then added, "You're quite interested, aren't you? Most guests just want to forget." Miss Marple smiled, her expression vague. "Oh, just an old lady's curiosity, Inspector. One likes to see justice done." But her mind was racing, picturing Victoria in a guest's room, perhaps stumbling. On the photograph, something worse. She thought of Tim's vial, Edward's watchfulness and the poison's botanical source, and knew the truth was close, like a shadow just out of sight. Retiring to her bungalow, Miss Marple sat by her window, the moonlight casting patterns on the floor. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a midnight glimpse of a stranger had once unmasked a killer. The Golden Palms Hotel, for all its tropical allure, was no different. People hid their truths, but they could not hide forever. A vial, a promise, a watcher, she murmured, her eyes bright, and a secret that kills. Chapter 7. The Botanist's Secret. The Golden Palms Hotel. Its tropical charm, strained by the weight of recent tragedies, shimmered under the Caribbean sun like a mirage hiding its flaws. 5 days had passed since Major Palgrave's sudden death, and 3 since Victoria Johnson's poisoning, yet the guests clung to their routines, lounging by the pool, sipping rum punches, and dancing to steel drums as if normalcy could erase the unease that clung to the air like humidity. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a shaded alcove of the hotel's open-air lounge, her knitting a soft rhythm in her lap, observed the scene with her customary deceptive mildness. Her pale blue eyes, sharp despite her frail appearance, darted from face to face, catching the subtle tells of fear, guilt, or calculation that others missed. 2 deaths so closely linked were no accident, and Miss Marple, with her St. Mary Mead instincts, sensed a conspiracy tightening like a noose. Her thoughts were a tapestry of clues woven from the past few days. Palgrave's photograph of a murderer vanished with his belongings. Tim Kendall's furtive midnight handling of a vial, Molly's haunted expression, Victoria's hint of a discovery in a guest's room, Edward Hillingdon's silent vigil from his balcony, the poison that killed Victoria, rare plant extract. 2 botanical expertise, and Miss Marple's mind lingered on Evelyn Hillingdon, whose reserved demeanour and knowledge of toxic flora made her a figure of quiet intrigue. Each clue, like a pebble in a mosaic, was beginning to form a picture, and Miss Marple, with her gentle persistence, was determined to see it clearly. The lounge, cooled by ceiling fans, hummed with the low chatter of guests playing cards or reading. Miss Marple, her shawl draped loosely over her shoulders, pretended to doze, her knitting needles still, a pose that invited confidences while shielding her sharp mind. She had spent the morning probing delicately, her questions cloaked in the guise of an old lady's curiosity. The canon's mention of Palgrave's fraud case, Lucky's revelation of Molly's distress, Esther's account of Victoria's unease, and Dr. Graham's explanation of Digitalis' deadly potential had all deepened her suspicions. Tim Kendall, with his charming facade and whispered promises to Molly, loomed large in her thoughts, but others, Evelyn, Edward, even Lucky, played roles she could not yet define. Her reverie was broken by the sound of music drifting from the dining room, where preparations were underway for the evening's dance, a determined effort to lift the hotel's spirits. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow, and made her way to the dining room, her parasol a shield against the midday sun. The room was a flurry of activity. Staff arranged tables, hung lanterns, and tested the band's speakers, while Molly Kendall, pale but composed, directed the effort with a strained smile. Tim was absent, and Miss Marple noted Molly's quick glances toward the door. As if expecting her, dreading his arrival, she settled at a small table near the veranda, her knitting resumed, and watched as Evelyn Hillingdon entered, carrying a notebook filled with botanical sketches. Evelyn's sharp features softened as she studied a hibiscus bloom on a nearby table, her fingers tracing its petals with a scientist's precision. Miss Marple, seizing the opportunity, approached with her usual air of harmless curiosity. "Mrs. Hillingdon," she said, her voice soft and slightly quavering, "I couldn't help admiring your sketches. You have such a gift for capturing the plants here. They're so beautiful, but I've heard some can be dangerous. Is that true?" Evelyn looked up, her eyes narrowing briefly before her expression smoothed. "Oh yes," she said, her tone measured. "Many tropical plants have toxins, some medicinal, some deadly. It's a matter of dosage and intent. My husband and I study them for their properties, but we're careful, of course." She smiled, but it was thin, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened on her notebook. "How fascinating," Miss Marple said, her face all kindly interest. "I suppose it takes great skill to handle such things safely." "That poor girl, Victoria." Dr. Graham mentioned a plant poison. "It's so hard to imagine someone using such knowledge for harm." She watched Evelyn closely, her eyes gentle but unyielding. Evelyn's smile faltered, and for a moment her composure slipped, revealing a flicker of unease. "Yes, it's tragic," she said, her voice low, "but accidents happen, especially with untrained people handling plants they don't understand. The locals sometimes experiment, you know, with traditional remedies. It's likely that's what happened." She closed her notebook abruptly and stood. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I have some notes to organize." Miss Marple nodded, her expression vague, but her mind was alert. Evelyn's defensiveness, her quick shift to blaming locals, suggested she knew more than she admitted. The poison, Dr. Graham had said, was a rare alkaloid, not something a curious villager might stumble upon. Miss Marple thought of Evelyn's expertise, her access to the hotel's gardens, and her husband's distracted air, and wondered if their botanical work concealed a darker purpose. The afternoon passed in a haze of heat, with guests retreating to their bungalows or the pool. Miss Marple, feigning a need for shade, lingered in the lounge, where a bridge game was forming. She declined to play, citing her rheumatism, but took a seat nearby, her knitting a shield as she listened to the chatter. Canon Prescott and Joan discussed the dance with forced cheer, while Greg Dyson, his face flushed with rum, grumbled about the hotel's bad vibes. Lucky, perched on a stool, laughed too loudly, her eyes darting to the door whenever Tim Kendall passed. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the midnight encounter, Tim's vial, Molly's tearful plea, Edward's silent watchfulness. She recalled Dr. Graham's words about digitalis, how an overdose could mimic a heart attack, and wondered if Palgrave's death had been engineered with similar precision. The photograph, she suspected, was the keyer piece of proof, as the canon had said, that threatened someone's carefully guarded secret, but whose her musings were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Daventry, who entered the lounge to update the guests on Victoria's case. His clipped moustache and brisk manner commanded attention, and the room fell silent as he spoke. "We're pursuing several leads," he said, his voice firm. "The poison was a rare alkaloid, likely derived from a plant native to the island. We're interviewing everyone who had contact with Miss Johnson, but there's no cause for alarm. Please enjoy your evening." He nodded and left, his constables trailing behind. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, noted the guests' reactions. Joan Prescott sniffed, dismissing the police as inefficient, while the canon murmured a prayer for Victoria. Lucky Dyson whispered something to Greg, who shrugged and ordered another drink. Evelyn Hillingdon, seated alone, stared at her hands, her face unreadable, while Edward, sketching nearby, seemed oblivious, his pencil moving in sharp, erratic strokes. As the dance began, the dining room transformed into a vibrant scene, with lanterns casting a warm glow and the band's calypso rhythms filling the air. Miss Marple, declining to join, sat on the veranda, her shawl drawn close, her eyes on the dancers. Molly moved among the guests, her beauty striking but her smile fragile, like glass on the verge of shattering. Tim, now present, played the perfect host, but Miss Marple saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes scanned the room as if searching for a threat. She watched as Evelyn Hillingdon took a turn on the dance floor, her movements graceful, but mechanical, her eyes distant. Edward, standing by the bar, sipped a drink and watched his wife, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple, her mind turning over Evelyn's earlier unease, decided to probe further. She approached Edward, her demeanour all kindly confusion. "Mr. Hillingdon," she said, her voice soft, "I was just speaking with your wife about her botanical work. It's so impressive, all those plants and their properties. I suppose you must know a great deal about them too. Were you ever consulted about poor Victoria's poison? It seems so specialized." Edward's pencil paused, and he looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Consulted? No, Miss Marple, I wasn't. Evelyn and I study plants for science, not for harm. The police asked about local flora, but I told them what I knows. A rare shrub, not something you'd find lying about. Probably a local remedy gone wrong." He returned to his sketch, his movements abrupt, and Miss Marple nodded, her face vague but her mind alert. His defensiveness, like Evelyn's, was telling. A local remedy, they both claimed, yet Dr. Graham had emphasized the poison's rarity. Miss Marple thought of the hotel's gardens, where such a shrub might grow, and Edward's late-night watchfulness. Was he protecting his wife, or something else? She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a husband's silence had shielded a wife's crime, and wondered if history was repeating itself. The dance grew livelier, but Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a sudden commotion near the bar. Greg Dyson, his voice slurred, was arguing with Tim Kendall, their words sharp but muffled by the music. "You can't keep dodging me, Kendall," Greg said, his face red. "I know what's going on, and I want my cut." Tim's smile was tight, his hand gripping Greg's arm as he steered him away. But Miss Marple caught the flash of anger in his eyes. Molly, nearby, watched the exchange, her face pale, and when Greg stumbled, knocking over a glass, she flinched, her hands trembling. She fled the room, her steps unsteady, and Miss Marple, her knitting forgotten, felt a surge of concern. Molly's fear, Tim's agitation, Greg's accusations pointed to a secret that was unraveling. Like a poorly knit scarf, she followed Molly at a discreet distance, her steps slow but purposeful, and saw her pause near the hibiscus hedge, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Miss Marple hesitated, then approached, her voice gentle. "Mrs. Kendall," she said, "you seem so distressed. Is there anything an old lady like me can do? Sometimes sharing a burden makes it lighter." Molly started, wiping her eyes. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice breaking, "it's nothing really, just everything. The deaths, the hotel Timmies, so worried about the business. I'm fine, truly." But her eyes, wide and shadowed, told a different story, and she hurried away, leaving Miss Marple standing in the moonlight. Returning to the veranda, Miss Marple resumed her seat, her thoughts a whirl of connections. Greg's mention of a cut, Tim's midnight vial, Molly's fear, and the Hillingdons' botanical expertise all pointed to a scheme perhaps financial. perhaps murderous, that Palgrave's photograph had threatened to expose. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a public quarrel had once revealed a hidden motive, and knew that the dance, with its heightened emotions, might have loosened tongues. As the night deepened, she lingered, her knitting a quiet companion. The music faded, and the guests drifted to their bungalows, their laughter tinged with exhaustion. Miss Marple, her eyes bright, thought of the vial, the poison, the photograph, and the secrets that bound them. A dance of motives, she murmured, her needles still, and a killer who steps too boldly. Chapter 8. The Missing Link, the Golden Palms Hotel. Its tropical allure fraying under the strain of recent tragedies, shimmered in the morning light of St. Honor, its whitewashed walls and vibrant gardens masking a growing unease. 6 days had passed since Major Palgrave's sudden death, and for since Victoria Johnson's poisoning, and the guests, though clinging to their holiday routines, moved with the caution of those navigating a stage where the script had gone awry. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a quiet corner of the hotel's lounge, her knitting a soft whisper in her lap, observed the scene with her deceptive air of mildness. Her pale blue eyes, sharp as a seamstress's needle, darted from face to face, catching the subtle flickers of fear, guilt, or calculation that betrayed hidden truths. 2 deaths, linked by more than chance, formed a puzzle that Miss Marple, with her St. Mary Mead-honed instincts, was determined to solve. Her thoughts were a tapestry of clues, each thread carefully gathered over the past week. Palgrave's photograph, vanished with his belongings, which he'd claimed showed a murderer. Tim Kendall's furtive handling of a vial in the moonlight. Molly's haunted demeanor. Victoria's hint of a discovery in a guest's room. Edward Hillingdon's silent watchfulness. Evelyn's guarded responses about toxic plants. Greg Dyson's drunken accusations against Tim. The dance the previous evening, with its heated exchanges and Molly's tearful flight, had sharpened her suspicions, suggesting a conspiracy, perhaps financial, perhaps murderous, that Palgrave's photograph had threatened to unravel. Miss Marple, with her gentle persistence, knew that the key lay in connecting these fragments, and she resolved to probe deeper, her questions cloaked in the guise of an old lady's curiosity. The lounge, stirred by ceiling fans, hummed with the low chatter of guests reading or playing cards, their voices subdued, as if wary of disturbing the fragile calm. Miss Marple, her shawl draped loosely over her shoulders, pretended to doze, her knitting needle still, a pose that invited confidences while shielding her agile mind. She had spent the morning reflecting on the canon's mention of Palgrave's fraud case, Lucky's slip about Molly's distress, Esther's account of Victoria's unease, and Dr. Graham's explanation of Digitalis's deadly potential. The poison that killed Victoria, rare alkaloid from a local shrub, pointed to botanical expertise. And Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the Hillingdons, whose reserved demeanor and scientific knowledge made them figures of quiet intrigue. Yet Tim Kendall, with his whispered promises to Molly and his midnight prowling, remained at the heart of her suspicions. Her reverie was broken by the arrival of Joan Prescott, who bustled into the lounge with her usual brisk efficiency, organizing a group for a market tour in the nearby village. The canon, trailing behind, adjusted his spectacles and offered Miss Marple a kindly smile. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, settling nearby. "I hope you're managing with all this dreadful business." Joan's determined to keep everyone's spirits up, but it's a challenge, isn't it? "Indeed it is," Miss Marple said, her voice soft and slightly quavering, as if roused from a nap. Such a shock, losing 2 people so suddenly. I was just thinking of poor Victoria. She was so lively, always chatting. I don't suppose she ever mentioned anything to you, Canon, about Major Palgrave or his stories. He was so fond of that photograph, and I can't help wondering what became of it." The Canon frowned, his round face creasing with thought. "Well, now you mention it, she did say something the day before she died. I was in the garden, and she was sweeping the path, chattering as usual. She mentioned Palgrave showing her a picture once, said it was an old snap of a bad man. Her words. I thought she meant one of his army tales, but she seemed excited, as if it was more than that. I didn't press her, of course." He shook his head, his eyes troubled. Miss Marple's needles twitched, though she did not pick them up. An old snap of a bad man. The phrase echoed Palgrave's boast about a murderer, and Victoria's excitement suggested she had recognized its significance, perhaps connected to someone at the hotel. She thought of Tim Kendall's quick dismissal of the photograph, his insistence that Palgrave's room had been cleared, and her suspicions deepened. "How curious," she murmured, "and nothing else." She didn't say where she saw it, or with whom. The Canon shook his head. "No, that was all. I wish I'd paid more attention, but she was always full of stories. Poor girl." He sighed, and Joan, overhearing, called him to join the market group, her voice sharp with impatience. Miss Marple nodded absently, her mind racing. Victoria's death, so soon after Palgrave's, suggested she had stumbled onto a secret too dangerous to keep, and the photograph was the likely key. Determined to learn more, Miss Marple decided to visit Victoria's family in the village, a gesture of condolence that might yield further clues. She arranged for a hotel driver, a quiet young man named Samuel, and set out after breakfast, her parasol shielding her from the sun. The village, a cluster of colourful shacks and bustling stalls, was alive with the scents of spices and the chatter of vendors. Victoria's family lived in a modest house near the market, its walls adorned with bright murals. Miss Marple, her demeanour all kindly sympathy, was welcomed by Victoria's cousin, Leela, a sturdy woman with a warm smile but eyes red from grief. "I'm so sorry for your loss," Miss Marple said, settling on a wooden bench in the small living room. Victoria was such a bright girl, always so cheerful at the hotel. I wanted to pay my respects, and perhaps, well, one does wonder if she was troubled by anything before the end. She seemed so observant, you know. Leela nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "Thank you, ma'am." Victoria was a light, always talking, always curious. The last time I saw her, 2 days before it happened, she was all excited, said she'd found something at the hotel, papers and a picture, she called it, in one of the guest rooms. Said it was a secret, something big, but she wouldn't tell me more, just kept giggling. I told her to be careful, but she laughed it off. Leela's voice broke, and she looked away, her hands twisting together. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained gentle. "Papers and a picture," she repeated softly. "How intriguing. Did she say whose room or what kind of picture?" "I'm sure it was nothing, but one does wonder." Leela shook her head. "No, ma'am, she didn't say. Just that it was important, and she was going to sort it out. I thought maybe she meant hotel business, you know, with Mr. Kendall. She liked him, said he was kind, but now," she trailed off, her eyes filling with tears, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind whirling. Papers and a picture. The photograph, perhaps, or something related, document tied to Palgrave's fraud case, or proof of a crime. Miss Marple thought of Tim Kendall, who had laughed with Palgrave the night he died, and whose room Victoria might have cleaned. Had she found the photograph in his bungalow, or something incriminating? The poison that killed her, so precise and rare, suggested a desperate act to silence her, and Miss Marple's suspicions crystallized around the hotel's charming manager. Back at the hotel, she took a light lunch in the dining room, her eyes on Tim, who moved among the guests with his usual ease, though his smile seemed strained. Molly, serving coffee, was pale, her hands unsteady, and Miss Marple noted the way she avoided Tim's gaze, as if afraid of what she might see. The other guests, Canon Prescott, Joan, the Hillingdons, the Dysons ate and chatted, but their voices were subdued, the weight of recent events pressing down like the heat. Miss Marple, feigning a need for rest, lingered in the lounge, where she overheard a conversation between Lucky Dyson and a fellow guest, a retired banker named Mr. Raphael. "It's creepy, isn't it?" Lucky was saying, her voice low but carrying. "First Palgrave, then Victoria. Greg says the hotel's cursed, but I think it's something else. Tim's been acting so strange, and Molly's a wreck. I saw her crying again this morning, behind the kitchen." She paused, then added, "Victoria told me once that Palgrave had a picture of someone important. I thought she was just gossiping, but now I wonder." Mr. Raphael, a gruff man with a cane, snorted. "Gossip's all it is. Palgrave was a windbag, always waving that wallet of his. Probably just a photo of his old colonel. As for Kendall, he's got enough on his plate running this place. Leave the police to sort it out." He hobbled away, but Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind seizing on Lucky's words. A picture of someone important. The phrase echoed. Victoria's bad man. And Miss Marple wondered if the photograph showed Tim or someone connected to him. Determined to test her theory, she approached Tim Kendall later that afternoon, as he was checking the guest register in the lobby. "Mr. Kendall," she said, her voice soft and slightly confused, "I was just thinking about poor Major Palgrave. He mentioned a story once about a fraud case he investigated years ago. You were so kind to listen to his tales. Did he ever share that one with you?" "I believe it involved a young man who disappeared." Tim's hand froze on the register, and for a moment his boyish charm faltered, revealing a flicker of alarm. "Fraud case," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "No, Miss Marple, he didn't mention that. Just the usual army stories, tigers and battles. I didn't pay much attention." He smiled, but it was tight, and he quickly changed. The subject offering to arrange a car for her next outing. Miss Marple nodded, her face vague, but her mind was alert. His reaction, so swift and guarded, confirmed her suspicions. The fraud case, mentioned by the canon, might be the key crime from Tim's past. Perhaps that Palgrave's photograph had threatened to expose, she thought, of Victoria's discovery, the papers and picture, and wondered if they were hidden in Tim's bungalow or destroyed to protect his secret. The evening brought a quiet dinner, with guests dining under the stars on the veranda. Miss Marple, seated alone, watched the interactions. Evelyn Hillingdon's reserved silence, Edward's distracted sketching, Lucky's nervous laughter, Greg's sullen drinking. Molly, serving dessert, moved like a shadow, her beauty dimmed by exhaustion, while Tim, ever the host, kept the conversation light, though his eyes were restless. Miss Marple, her knitting a quiet companion, felt the puzzle nearing completion, but one piece, the photograph's exact nature, remained elusive as she retired to her bungalow. She noticed something amiss. her knitting bag left on the bedside table was slightly askew, its contents disturbed. Nothing was missing, but the subtle intrusion sent a chill through her. Someone had been in her room, searching, perhaps, for notes or clues. She thought of Tim's alarm, Molly's fear, and the poison's deadly precision, and knew the killer was growing desperate. In St. Mary Mead, a similar violation had preceded a third death, and Miss Marple resolved to be cautious, her eyes bright with determination, Dot sitting by her window. The moonlight casting patterns on the floor, she reflected on the missing link. The photograph, the fraud, the poison all pointed to a secret that had cost 2 lives and might claim more. A picture and papers, she murmured, her needle still, and a past that refuses to stay buried. Chapter 9. A dangerous game. The Golden Palms Hotel, its tropical splendor tarnished by a week of tragedy, stood under the Caribbean sun like a grand dame hiding her scars. 7 days had passed since Major Palgrave's death, and 5 since Victoria, Johnson's poisoning, and the guests, though clinging to their sun-soaked routines, moved with the unease of actors sensing a trapdoor beneath the stage. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a shaded corner of the hotel's lounge, her knitting a soft murmur in her lap, observed the scene with her customary air of deceptive frailty. Her pale blue eyes, sharp as a falcon's, caught every fleeting glance, every nervous gesture, weaving a tapestry of suspicion from the clues she had gathered. The photograph, Tim Kendall's midnight vial, Molly's fear, Victoria's discovery, the Hillingdons' botanical expertise, and the disturbed knitting bag in her room all pointed to a conspiracy, and Miss Marple, with her St. Mary Mead instincts, knew the killer was growing desperate. Her morning had begun with a quiet resolve to press forward, her gentle probing cloaked in the guise of an old lady's curiosity. The canon's hint of Palgrave's fraud case, Leela's revelation of Victoria's papers and picture, Lucky's gossip about Molly's distress, and the subtle intrusion into her room had sharpened her focus. Tim Kendall, with his charming facade and guarded reactions, remained at the heart of her suspicions. But others, Evelyn Hillingdon, with her knowledge of poisons, Edward with his silent watchfulness, and even Lucky Dyson, with her careless chatter, played roles she could not yet define. The photograph, she suspected, was the linchpin, a piece of evidence that had cost 2 lives and threatened a third. Miss Marple, ever patient, knew that a killer's fear could be their undoing, and she resolved to set a subtle trap, using the very curiosity that had unnerved her intruder. The lounge, stirred by the hum of ceiling fans, was a haven of subdued activity, with guests reading newspapers or playing cards, their voices low, as if wary of breaking the fragile calm. Miss Marple, her shawl draped loosely over her shoulders, pretended to doze, her knitting needle still, a pose that invited confidences while shielding her agile mind. She had spent the morning reflecting on the disturbed knitting bag, a warning that someone, likely Tim, given his alarm at her mention of the fraud case, suspected her interest went beyond idle gossip. The thought did not frighten her. In St. Mary Mead, she had faced similar threats, and her frail appearance had always been her greatest ally, disarming those who underestimated her. Her thoughts were interrupted by a commotion in the dining room, where breakfast was winding down. Greg Dyson, his face flushed with rum despite the early hour, had collapsed at his table, his body slumped over a half-eaten plate of eggs. The room erupted in gasps and shouts, and Miss Marple, rising slowly, her heart quickening but her expression calm, moved to the veranda for a better view. Dr. Graham, summoned from his nearby cottage, pushed through the crowd, his medical bag in hand. and knelt beside Greg, his weathered face grim as he checked for a pulse. "He's dead," Dr. Graham announced, his voice low but carrying in the stunned silence. "Looks like an overdose, Bills, by the look of it. There's a bottle in his pocket." He held up a small vial, its label obscured, and the guests murmured, their shock tinged with fear. "Suicide, perhaps," Dr. Graham added, but his tone was uncertain, and Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, noted the neatness of the scene, the vial clutched too perfectly, the body arranged too precisely, like a tableau, staged for effect. Inspector Daventry arrived within the hour, his clipped mustache and brisk manner commanding order. He cordoned off the dining room, questioning staff and guests with methodical precision. Miss Marple, lingering nearby, her knitting resumed as a prop, overheard his initial findings. The pills were barbiturates, a sedative Greg was known to take for insomnia, but the dose was far beyond therapeutic. "Could be accidental," Daventry said to a constable, "but I don't like the timing. 3 deaths in a week, it's no coincidence." Miss Marple's mind raced, her face serene, but her thoughts sharp. Suicide, she doubted it. Greg's drunken accusations against Tim the previous evening, his demand for a cut, suggested he knew something dangerous, perhaps tied to the hotel's finances or Palgrave's photograph. His death, so soon after Victoria's, felt like another silencing, and Miss Marple suspected the same hand behind all 3. The staged scene, with its carefully placed vial, reminded her of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a suicide had masked a murder, and she resolved to probe deeper, her suspicions centering on Tim Kendall. She approached Lucky Dyson, who stood near the lounge entrance, her blonde hair disheveled, her eyes red but oddly dry. "Mrs. Dyson," Miss Marple said, her voice soft and sympathetic, "I'm so terribly sorry about your husband. Such a shock. I don't suppose he was troubled before this. He seemed so lively, but one never knows what burdens people carry." Lucky's lips trembled, but her expression was more relieved than grieved, a detail Miss Marple noted with interest. "Troubled," Lucky said, her voice sharp. "Greg was always troubled. Gambling, drinking, you name it. He owed money to half the island, including Tim. I told him to stop pushing, but he wouldn't listen. Said he had leverage on someone, thought it'd fix everything." She paused, her eyes flicking to Miss Marple, then away. "Guess he just gave up." Her voice lacked conviction, and Miss Marple's suspicions deepened. "Leverage," Miss Marple repeated softly, her face all kindly concern. "How curious. Did he mention what it was? Or perhaps Victoria knew something, she was so observant, wasn't she?" She watched Lucky closely, noting the slight stiffening of her posture. "Victoria," Lucky said, her tone too casual. "No, she didn't say anything to me. Just hotel gossip, you know. I'm sure it's nothing." She forced a smile and excused herself, her steps quick, and Miss Marple filed away her evasive, suspecting Lucky knew more than she admitted perhaps about Greg's leverage or the photograph. The morning passed in a haze of tension, with guests retreating to their bungalows or whispering in small groups. Miss Marple, feigning a need for fresh air, took a slow walk through the gardens, her parasol shielding her from the sun. She paused near Tim and Molly's cottage, where she saw Molly standing on the veranda, her face pale, her hands twisting a dishcloth. Tim emerged, his expression strained, and whispered something to her, his hand gripping her arm. Molly nodded, her eyes downcast, and Miss Marple, hidden by a bougainvillea trellis, caught the words "keep quiet" before Tim moved. Off toward the hotel, Her thoughts turned to the Hillingdons, whose botanical expertise remained a nagging thread. She sought out Evelyn, who was in the garden, examining a cluster of oleander with her notebook in hand. "Mrs. Hillingdon," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle, "I was just thinking about poor Mr. Dyson. Such a tragedy, I suppose. With your knowledge of plants, you've been asked about poisons before. The police must find your expertise invaluable." Evelyn's hand froze, and her sharp features tightened, though her voice remained calm. "Occasionally," she said, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's briefly, "but not in this case. Barbiturates aren't botanical, Miss Marple. It's a medical matter, not a plant one. I told Inspector Daventry what I know, which is little." She closed her notebook and walked away, her steps brisk, and Miss Marple noted the defensiveness in her tone, a contrast to her usual composure. Returning to the lounge, Miss Marple joined a bridge game, her mind only half on the cards as she listened to the guests' chatter. Canon Prescott, his voice heavy, spoke of Greg's sad end, while Joan dismissed it as self-inflicted folly. Edward Hillingdon, playing opposite Miss Marple, was silent, his eyes fixed on his cards, but Miss Marple caught the way his fingers trembled, as if wrestling with an unseen burden. She thought of his balcony vigil, his silent observation of Tim's midnight movements, and wondered if he suspected or knew more than he let on. Determined to test her theory, Miss Marple devised a subtle trap. She approached Tim Kendall in the lobby, her demeanour all kindly confusion. "Mr. Kendall," she said, "I've been so forgetful lately. I meant to ask you to fetch my shawl from my room. It's the blue one, on the chair. And while you're there, do check if I left my notebook on the table. It's full of silly little jottings about the hotel. You know, things I've noticed." She smiled, her eyes gentle but watchful, knowing the notebook, deliberately left out, contained cryptic notes about the deaths designed to unnerve a guilty party. Tim's smile was tight, his eyes flickering with unease. "Of course, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth but strained. "I'll have a staff member check right away." He turned away, his steps quick, and Miss Marple, returning to the lounge, positioned herself to watch the bungalow. Within minutes, she saw Tim slip into her room, his movements furtive, and emerge moments later, his face pale, clutching her notebook. He glanced around, then hurried to his cottage, and Miss Marple's heart quickened, her trap sprung. She confided in Dr. Graham later that afternoon, her voice quavering with feigned concern. "Doctor," she said, "I'm so worried I've been careless. I left a notebook in my room, full of thoughts about poor Major Palgrave and Victoria. Silly things, really, but I mentioned that photograph, and, well, I think someone's been in my room again. Do you think I should tell the inspector?" She watched his reaction, noting the worry in his eyes, and knew her words would spread, unsettling the killer further as evening fell. Miss Marple sat on the veranda, her knitting a quiet companion, her eyes on the bungalows. The hotel was subdued. The dance cancelled in light of Greg's death, and the guests retired early, their voices hushed. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a staged suicide had once revealed a killer's desperation, and knew the third death had narrowed the field. Tim's reaction to her notebook, Lucky's evasiveness, and the Hillingdons' guardedness all pointed to a secret tied to the photographer fraud, perhaps, or a past crime that Greg had threatened to expose. Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, a creak from her bungalow's veranda. She rose, her heart steady despite the hour, and peered through the window. A shadow moved, holding something that glinted, a syringe, perhaps, or a vial. Miss Marple's breath caught, but she was prepared. She had left her door unlocked, a calculated risk, and alerted Inspector Daventry earlier, hinting at her suspicions without naming Tim. As the shadow slipped inside, she cried out, her voice sharp in the silence, and footsteps thundered from the gardens, where Daventry and a constable had been waiting. The shadow Tim Kendall froze, the syringe dropping from his hand as the inspector seized him. "It's over," Kendall Daventry said, his voice grim. "We've got you." Tim's face crumpled, his charm shattered, and Miss Marple, stepping into the moonlight, nodded quietly, her knitting folded neatly in her arms. The trap had worked, and the truth, like a tide, was rising. Chapter 10. The Trapdoor Golden Palms Hotel. Its tropical allure dimmed by a week of mounting tragedies, stood under the Caribbean moon like a stage awaiting the final act of a grim drama. 8 days had passed since Major Palgrave's death, 6 since Victoria Johnson's poisoning, and 1 since Greg Dyson's staged suicide, and the guests, their holiday spirit shattered, moved with the wariness of those sensing a predator in the shadows. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her bungalow's modest armchair, her knitting a silent companion in her lap, gazed through the window at the moonlit gardens, her pale blue eyes sharp with purpose. The web of Cluse Palgrave's vanished photograph, Tim Kendall's midnight vial, Molly's fear, Victoria's discovery, the Hillingdons' botanical knowledge, Greg's accusations, and the intrusion into her room had tightened into a noose. And Miss Marple, with her St. Mary Mead instincts, was ready to spring a trap to unmask the killer. Her day had been one of calculated risks, her gentle probing cloaked in the guise of an old lady's absent-mindedness. The canon's hint of Palgrave's fraud case, Lila's account of Victoria's papers and picture, Lucky's gossip about Greg's leverage, Dr. Graham's warning about digitalis, and Tim's pale-faced reaction to her notebook, had confirmed her suspicions. Tim Kendall, with his boyish charm and whispered promises to Molly, was at the heart of a conspiracy, likely tied to a past crime the photograph threatened to expose. Greg's death, staged to look like suicide, had been a desperate act to silence his threats, and the disturbed knitting bag in her room suggested the killer now saw her as a danger. Miss Marple, undaunted, had devised a plan to force the culprit's hand, using her apparent frailty as bait. The morning had begun with a quiet breakfast, where the guests' subdued chatter was punctuated by nervous glances. Inspector Daventry's investigation into Greg's death had intensified the hotel's tension, with constables questioning staff and searching bungalows for traces of barbiturates. Miss Marple, seated near Canon Prescott and his sister, Joan, sipped her tea, her knitting folded neatly, her ears attuned to the whispers. The Canon, his round face creased with worry, spoke of Greg's tragic end, while Joan, her brisk manner undeterred, dismissed it as another fool overdoing it with pills. Miss Marple, her expression vague, murmured agreement, but her mind was elsewhere. Piecing together the killer's motives, she had planted the first seed of her trap during a morning walk, approaching Tim Kendall in the lobby with feigned confusion. "Mr. Kendall," she said, her voice quavering, "I'm so forgetful these days. I left my shawl in my room, the blue one, on the chair. Could you fetch it for me? And while you're there, do check if my notebook's on the table. It's full of silly jottings about the hotel things I've noticed. You know, about poor Major Palgrave and Victoria." She smiled, her eyes gentle but watchful, knowing the notebook, left deliberately, contained cryptic notes about the deaths, photo fraud, vial at midnight, poison from gardens. The entries were vague enough to unsettle, precise enough to provoke. Tim's smile had been tight, his eyes flickering with alarm. "Of course, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth but strained. "I'll send someone right away." But Miss Marple, lingering nearby, saw him slip toward her bungalow himself, his steps quick, his glance furtive. She had anticipated this, ensuring her room was unlocked, the notebook prominently placed. From the lounge, she watched through a window as Tim emerged, his face pale, clutching the notebook, his eyes darting as he hurried to his cottage. Her heart quickened, but her expression remained serene. The bait had been taken. Her next move was to sow doubt among the guests, amplifying the killer's fear of exposure. She joined a bridge game in the lounge, her play absent-minded but precise, and steered the conversation to the recent deaths. "It's so troubling," she said, her voice soft, addressing Evelyn Hillingdon, who sat opposite, her sharp features composed. 3 deaths, all so sudden. "I keep thinking about Major Palgrave's photograph. He said it was proof of something. And Victoria, poor girl, mentioned papers in a room. I wonder if the police have found them yet." She paused, her eyes meeting Evelyn's, noting the slight tightening of her hands on her cards. Evelyn's voice was calm, but her eyes flickered. "Papers. I'm sure it's nothing, Miss Marple. Servants love to gossip, and Palgrave was full of tall tales. The police will sort it out." She played her card with deliberate care, but Miss Marple saw the tension in her posture, a sign that her words had struck a nerve. She turned to Lucky Dyson, who was partnered with the Canon, her blonde hair catching the light. "Mrs. Dyson," Miss Marple said, "you knew Mr. Dyson best. Did he ever mention anything about Major Palgrave, or perhaps Victoria? He seemed so outspoken before the end." "I heard him arguing with Mr. Kendall something about money, wasn't it?" Lucky's laugh was brittle, her fingers toying with her necklace. "Greg, he was always arguing, Miss Marple. Too much rum, that's all. He thought Tim owed him something. But it was just talk. As for Victoria, she was always chattering, said something once about a picture, but I didn't listen. It's all so awful." Her eyes darted to the door, where Tim was visible, speaking to a staff member, and Miss Marple noted her unease, suspecting Lucky knew more about Greg's leverage than she admitted. The bridge game ended, and Miss Marple, feigning fatigue, retired to the veranda. Her knitting resumed as she watched the bunk. She had confided in Dr. Graham earlier, her voice quavering with calculated concern. "Doctor," she said, "I'm so worried I've been careless. My notebook, with all my silly thoughts about the deaths, it's gone missing from my room. I mentioned the photograph, and that vial I saw in the gardens at night. Do you think I should tell Inspector Daventry? I'd hate to cause a fuss, but—" She trailed off, her eyes gentle, knowing her words would spread, unsettling the killer. Further, Dr. Graham's face had tightened, his worry evident. "A vial, you say? That's troubling, Miss Marple. I'll mention it to the inspector, but be careful. These are dangerous times." He patted her hand, and Miss Marple nodded, her trap's second layer set, by hinting at her observations. Without naming Tim, she ensured the rumor would circulate, pushing the killer to act. The afternoon brought a tense calm, with guests avoiding the dining room where Greg's body had been found, and gathering instead by the pool. Miss Marple, her parasol shielding her from the sun, took a slow walk through the gardens, her eyes on Tim and Molly's cottage. She saw Molly standing on the veranda, her golden hair loose, her face pale as she stared at the hibiscus hedge. Tim emerged, his expression strained, and whispered something, his hand on her shoulder. Molly nodded, her eyes downcast, and Miss Marple, hidden by a palm, caught the words "no one knows" before Tim moved off toward the hotel. Her thoughts turned to the Hillingdons, whose botanical expertise remained a nagging thread. She approached Edward, who was in the garden, sorting plant samples with meticulous care. "Mr. Hillingdon," she said, her voice gentle, "I've been so impressed by your work. All these plants, some so dangerous, I hear. Did you ever see Major Palgrave with anything unusual? Perhaps a photograph? He was so proud of it, and I wonder if it had anything to do with, well, you know." Edward's hands paused, his eyes narrowing. "A photograph? No, Miss Marple. He never showed me anything like that. As for plants, we're scientists, not poisoners. I told the police what I know, nothing more." His tone was sharp, and he returned to his samples, his movements abrupt. Miss Marple nodded, her face vague, but her mind noted his defensiveness. A contrast to his usual distraction. Was he protecting Evelyn or himself? The evening brought a subdued dinner, with guests dining under the stars, their voices hushed. Miss Marple, seated alone, watched the interactions. Evelyn's reserved silence, Edward's restless sketching, Lucky's forced cheer, Molly's mechanical service. Tim, ever the host, moved among the tables, but his smile was strained, his eyes darting to Miss Marple's corner more than once. She met his gaze with a gentle smile, her knitting steady, knowing her trap was closing, determined to force the killer's hand. She had taken a final risk, leaving her bungalow door unlocked. That night, a calculated invitation. She had alerted Inspector Daventry earlier, in a private moment, hinting at her suspicions without naming Tim. "Inspector," she said, her voice quavering, "I've seen things movements at night, a vial in the gardens. My notebooks gone, and I fear someone knows I've noticed. I'll leave my door open tonight, just in case. Please keep watch." Daventry, his moustache twitching, had agreed, stationing a constable in the shadows as midnight approached. Miss Marple sat in her darkened room, her knitting folded, her senses alert. The moonlight cast patterns on the floor, and the distant hum of cicadas filled the silence. She heard a faint creak on the veranda, then the soft click of her door opening. A shadow slipped inside, tall and lean, holding a syringe that glinted in the dim light. Miss Marple's heart raced, but she remained still, her voice ready. As the figure approached, she cried out, sharp and clear, "Help! Someone's here!" Footsteps thundered from the gardens, and Inspector Daventry burst in, his flashlight sweeping the room. The figure Tim Kendall froze, the syringe dropping from his hand as a constable seized him. "You're done, Kendall," Daventry said, his voice grim. "We've got you." Tim's face crumpled, his charm shattered, and Miss Marple, rising slowly, stepped into the moonlight, her knitting clutched like a shield. The trap had sprung, and the killer, caught in his own desperation, had revealed himself. Daventry turned to her, his eyes appraising. "You're a brave woman, Miss Marple," he said, "and a clever one. We'll take it from here." Miss Marple nodded, her expression mild, but her mind was already turning to the next step, the confession that would unravel the conspiracy. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a trap had once ensnared a killer, and knew that truth, like a tide, would wash away the lies. Chapter 11. The Confession, the Golden Palms Hotel. Its tropical splendor muted by the weight of a week's tragedies. lay under the Caribbean dawn like a stage stripped of its props, awaiting the final curtain. 9 days had passed since Major Palgrave's death, 7 since Victoria Johnson's poisoning, and 2 since Greg Dyson's staged suicide, and the arrest of Tim Kendall the previous night had sent a ripple of shock through the guests, shattering the fragile illusion of normalcy. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the hotel's lounge, her knitting a soft whisper in her lap, observed the subdued scene with her customary air of deceptive mildness. Her pale blue eyes, sharp as a seamstress's needle, caught the nervous glances and hushed whispers of those around her, but her face remained serene, betraying none of the satisfaction she felt at having sprung her trap. The web of Clousebelgrave's photograph, Tim's midnight vial, Molly's fear, Victoria's discovery, the Hillingdons' botanical expertise, Greg's accusations, and her disturbed knitting bag had led to Tim's capture, and now Miss Marple, with her St. Mary Mead instincts, awaited the confession that would unravel the conspiracy's final threads. The morning had begun with a tense quiet, the guests gathering in small clusters, their voices low as they speculated about Tim's arrest. Inspector Daventry, his clipped moustache and brisk manner a reassuring presence, had stationed constables around the hotel, ensuring order while he interrogated Tim at the local police station. Miss Marple, declining breakfast in the dining room, had chosen the lounge for its vantage point, where she could observe the guests' reactions. Her trap the previous night leaving, her door unlocked, her cry for help, and Daventry's timely intervention had caught Tim in the act, a syringe in hand, his intent unmistakable. Yet questions remained. What secret had driven him to kill 3 times? And who was his accomplice? The lover hinted at in his whispered promises to Molly. The lounge, cooled by ceiling fans, was a haven of strained civility, with guests pretending to read or play cards, their eyes darting to the door for news. Miss Marple, her shawl draped loosely over her shoulders, knitted absently, her pose inviting confidences while shielding her agile mind. She had spent the morning reflecting on the clues that had led to this moment. The Canon's mention of Palgrave's fraud case, Leela's account of Victoria's papers and picture, Lucky's slip about Greg's leverage, Dr. Graham's warning about digitalis, Edward's balcony vigil, and Evelyn's guarded responses about poisons. Tim's attempt on her life confirmed his guilt, but the photograph's significance and the identity of his partner remained elusive. Like a shadow just out of reach, her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Canon Prescott and his sister, Joan, who settled nearby, their faces heavy with shock. The Canon, adjusting his spectacles, shook his head. "I can scarcely believe it," he said, his voice low. Young Kendall, of all people, so charming, so capable, to think he was behind it all. Palgrave, Victoria, Dyson. It's like something from a novel. Joan, her brisk manner subdued, snorted softly. "Charm's no guarantee of virtue, Jeremy. I always thought there was something too polished about him, like a salesman hiding bad goods. But to try to harm Miss Marple, well, it's monstrous." She glanced at Miss Marple, her eyes appraising. "You're braver than you look, my dear. Most women your age would have fled after the first death." Miss Marple smiled, her knitting needles clicking softly. "Oh, I'm just an old lady who notices things, Miss Prescott," she said, her voice quavering slightly. "I couldn't help but wonder about Major Palgrave's photograph and poor Victoria's talk of papers. It's so sad, isn't it, how secrets lead to such terrible ends." She let the words hang, watching the Canon's reaction. hoping to glean one final clue. The canon nodded, his face troubled. Secrets, yes. Palgrave was always hinting at that photograph, said it was from a case in his army days. A young man who'd swindled a fortune and vanished. I thought it was just another of his stories, but now, perhaps he recognized Kendall, or someone close to him. He sighed, and Joan, impatient, changed the subject to the hotel's future. But Miss Marple's mind seized on the word swindled, a confirmation of the fraud case that had haunted her thoughts. Her attention shifted to Molly Kendall, who entered the lounge, her golden hair disheveled, her face pale as a ghost. The guests' whispers grew louder, their eyes following her, but Molly seemed oblivious, her movements mechanical as she carried a tray of coffee cups. Miss Marple, her heart softening, noted the devastation in her eyes, grief, betrayal, or both, and resolved to speak with her, gently, as one might comfort a wounded bird. She rose, her steps slow, and approached Molly near the service table. "Mrs. Kendall," she said, her voice soft and sympathetic, "I'm so terribly sorry for all you've been through. You must be dreadfully shocked with Mr. Kendall's arrest. If there's anything an old lady like me can do, do let me know. Sometimes talking helps, doesn't it?" Molly's hands trembled, and a cup rattled against its saucer. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know what to say. Tim, he's not a monster. He can't be. It's all a mistake. It has to be." Her eyes, wide and shadowed, met Miss Marple's for a moment, then darted away, and she hurried off, her steps unsteady, leaving the tray behind. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her mind turning over Molly's words. Not a monster. Denial or loyalty. She thought of Tim's whispered promises, "No one will find out," and wondered if Molly was an innocent, caught in his web, or a reluctant accomplice protecting him out of love. The photograph, she suspected, held the key, and its connection to a past fraud suggested Tim had a history he'd killed to conceal. Midday brought news from Inspector Daventry, who arrived to brief the guests, his manner calm but authoritative. "Mr. Kendall is in custody," he said, addressing the lounge, "and we're confident we've apprehended the culprit behind the recent deaths. He's being questioned, and we expect a full statement soon. There's no further danger, but please remain cooperative as we conclude our inquiries." He nodded and left, his constables trailing behind, and the guests erupted in murmurs, their relief tinged with curiosity. Miss Marple, her knitting steady, listened to the chatter, sifting for clues. Evelyn Hillingdon, seated nearby, closed her botanical notebook with a snap, her sharp features composed but her hands restless. Edward, sketching in a corner, seemed oblivious, his pencil moving in erratic strokes. Lucky Dyson, perched on a stool, laughed too loudly, her eyes darting to the door, while the canon and Joan debated whether to extend their stay. Miss Marple, her thoughts circling the photograph, resolved to learn more about Tim's past, suspecting his accomplice was among the guests. Watching, waiting, determined to uncover the final piece, she sought out Dr. Graham, who was in the garden, reviewing notes from his examination of Greg's body. "Doctor," she said, her voice quavering with feigned concern, "I've been so worried about poor Mrs. Kendall. She seems so lost. And with Mr. Kendall's arrest, do you think he acted alone? I keep thinking of Major Palgrave's photograph, and that fraud case he mentioned. It's silly, perhaps, but one wonders if someone else was involved." Dr. Graham frowned, his weathered face thoughtful. "Alone, hard to say, Miss Marple. Kendall's the type, charming but slippery. The police found digitalis in his cottage, enough to kill Palgrave, and a trace of that alkaloid from Victoria's case. As for the photograph, Daventry's looking for it, but it's likely gone. A fraud case, you say? That's new to me, but it fits Kendall's young. Could have had a past he wanted buried. He paused, his eyes appraising. You're sharp, aren't you? Be careful, now. Miss Marple smiled, her expression vague. Just an old lady's fancies, Doctor. But her mind was alert, filing away the confirmation of digitalis and the alkaloid. The photograph, she suspected, had shown Tim Moore someone he protected, and its discovery by Victoria had triggered the murders. The accomplice, she reasoned, was someone close, someone who benefited from the killings, and her thoughts turned to Lucky Dyson, whose evasive chatter and nervous glances suggested complicity. The afternoon brought a visit to the police station, where Miss Marple, with Daventry's permission, observed Tim's interrogation through a one-way glass, her presence justified as the intended victim. Tim, his boyish charm replaced by a haggard defiance, sat slumped in a chair, his hands cuffed. Daventry, his voice firm, pressed him with relentless precision. "We've got you, Kendall," he said. "Digitalis in your cottage, the alkaloid. In your desk, a syringe in your hand. 3 deaths Belgrave, Johnson, Dyson. Start talking, or it's the gallows." Tim's eyes flickered, his defiance crumbling. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Palgrave recognized me, knew me from a job I pulled years ago, a swindle in London. I was young, got away clean, changed. My name, he had that damn photograph, showed it to me, laughing, said he'd tell everyone. I spiked his digitalis, just a bit extra, thought it'd look natural." Miss Marple, behind the glass, nodded quietly, her knitting folded in her lap. The fraud case, confirmed. She listened as Tim continued, his voice breaking. "Victoria, she cleaned my room, found the photograph in my desk, started asking questions. I couldn't risk her talking, so I used the alkaloid, got it from a contact. It was quick, like they said. Greg, he figured out I was skimming hotel funds, wanted a cut, threatened to go to the police. I staged it, made it look like suicide. I didn't want to hurt anyone, I swear, but it snowballed." He buried his face in his hands, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, sensing a gap in his story. Daventry leaned forward, his voice sharp. "And Miss Marple, why her? She's no threat, just an old lady." Tim's head snapped up, his eyes wild. "She knew too much, kept asking about the photograph, the fraud. I saw her notebook, those notes she was onto me. I had to stop her, thought a small dose would look natural, like Palgrave. I wasn't alone, though. I had help, someone. Who planned it, kept me steady." Miss Marple's heart quickened, her suspicions confirmed. An accomplice, as she'd guessed. Daventry pressed, his voice like steel. "Who? Name them, Kendall, or you take the full weight." Tim hesitated, his eyes darting, then whispered, Lucky Dyson, she's my. We were together for years. Before Molly, she planned it, said we'd take the hotel's money, start over somewhere new. She got the alkaloid, told me how to stage Greg's death. She's the one who said to go after Miss Marple, said she was too close. Miss Marple, her face serene, felt the puzzle complete. Lucky, with her sharp laugh and nervous glances, had been the mastermind, using Tim's charm and desperation to execute her scheme. The photograph had threatened their plans, exposing Tim's past and their affair, and Lucky, with her cunning, had orchestrated the murders to protect their future. Miss Marple thought of St. Mary Mead, where our lovers. Betrayal had once unravelled a similar plot, and nodded quietly, her knitting steady. Daventry's voice softened, coaxing. And Molly, did she know? Tim shook his head, his voice raw. No, she didn't. I kept her out of it, told her it was just business stress. She's innocent, I swear. Don't drag her into this. His shoulders slumped, the fight gone. And Daventry signalled for the constable to take him away. Miss Marple, escorted back to the hotel, sat on the veranda. Her knitting resumed as she watched the guests. Lucky, unaware of Tim's confession, laughed with a group by the pool, her blonde hair catching the light, but Miss Marple saw the calculation in her eyes, the predator beneath the flirt. Daventry, moving swiftly, approached Lucky later that afternoon, his constables discreet but firm. "Mrs. Dyson," he said, "we need to speak with you. At the station, please." Lucky's smile faltered, her eyes darting, but she went quietly, her charm no match for the evidence mounting against her. The hotel, freed from the killer's shadow, began to breathe again, the guests' voices lighter, their smiles less forced. Miss Marple, her role in the trap known only to Daventry and Dr. Graham, knitted quietly, her thoughts on Molly, who sat alone in the garden, her face a mask of grief. Miss Marple approached, her voice gentle. "My dear," she said, "you've been through so much, but you're free now to start again. The truth, however painful, sets us free." Molly nodded, her eyes filling, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her heart heavy but hopeful. The confession had closed the case, but the scars would linger, like shadows in the sun. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where truth had always prevailed, and smiled faintly, her knitting a quiet rhythm in the fading light. Chapter 12. The Quiet Departure, the Golden Palms Hotel. Its tropical radiance restored under the Caribbean sun, shimmered like a jewel polished after a storm. 10 days had passed since Major Palgrave's death, 8 since Victoria Johnson's poisoning, 3 since Greg Dyson's staged suicide, and 1 since the arrests of Tim Kendall and Lucky Dyson, whose confessions had unravelled a web of deceit that had gripped the island of St. Honor. The guests, freed from the shadow of murder, resumed their holiday routines with a cautious relief, their laughter by the pool and chatter over rum punches carrying a note of gratitude, as if they had emerged from a dark play into the light of a new act. Miss Jane Marple, seated on the hotel's veranda, her knitting a soft rhythm in her lap, observed the scene with her customary air of deceptive mildness. Her pale blue eyes, sharp despite her frail appearance, caught the subtle shifts. In the guest's demeanor relief, yes, but also a lingering unease, like a melody that refused to resolve. The case was closed, but its echoes remained, and Miss Marple, with her St. Mary Mead instincts, reflected on the human frailties that had brought such tragedy to this sunlit paradise. The morning was warm, the air scented with hibiscus and frangipani, and the hotel bustled with a renewed energy. Staff swept the paths, rearranged loungers by the pool, and prepared for a farewell dinner, as many guests, including Miss Marple, were set to depart the following day. Her suitcase, neatly packed in her bungalow, stood ready, a reminder that her Caribbean sojourn, prompted by her nephew Raymond's concern for her rheumatism, was drawing to a close. Yet her thoughts were not on St. Mary Mead's quiet lanes or the vicarage's gossip, but on the intricate puzzle she had helped solve: Palgrave's photograph, Tim's vial, Molly's fear, Victoria's discovery, the Hillingdons' botanical expertise, Greg's accusations, and Lucky's cunning. all woven into a tapestry of greed and betrayal. Her day had begun with a light breakfast in the dining room, where the guests' chatter was brighter, though tempered by whispers of Tim and Lucky's confessions. Inspector Daventry, who had visited the hotel to tie up loose ends, had shared the details with Miss Marple in a private moment, his clipped moustache twitching with grudging admiration. "You're a marvel, Miss Marple," he had said, his voice low. Kendall spilled everything: his swindle in London, the photograph that could have ruined him, the murders to cover it up. And Mrs. Dyson, sharp as a blade, planned it all, down to the alkaloid and the staged suicide. "Without your trap, we might have missed her. You've a knack for this, haven't you?" Miss Marple had smiled, her knitting needles clicking softly. "Just an old lady's curiosity, Inspector," she said, her voice quavering slightly. "People are the same everywhere, you know, and secrets have a way of showing themselves, like weeds in a garden." Daventry had nodded, his eyes appraising, and left to file his report, promising to keep her role discreet as she preferred. Miss Marple, who had no taste for publicity, was content to fade into the background, her satisfaction drawn from the truth's emergence, not the spotlight. The lounge, where she now sat, was a hub of quiet activity, with guests writing postcards or playing bridge, their voices carrying a newfound ease. Canon Prescott and his sister Joan were at a nearby table, planning their return to England, their usual bickering softened by relief. The Canon, adjusting his spectacles, glanced at Miss Marple with a warm smile. "You're looking well, Miss Marple," he said. "I dare say this island's done you good, despite, well, everything. We're grateful for your quiet courage, you know. Joan says you're sharper than the inspector, and I'm inclined to agree." Joan, her brisk manner undimmed, snorted softly. "Sharp's the word, Canon. I'd have pegged Kendall for a rogue, but that Dyson woman, slippery as an eel, hiding. Behind all that giggling, you saw through them, Miss Marple, and I'll wager you've done it before." She raised an eyebrow, inviting a response, but Miss Marple only smiled, her knitting steady, her thoughts on St. Mary Mead, where similar compliments had followed similar cases. "Oh, I just notice things," she murmured, her voice soft. "People talk, and one listens, that's all. Poor Mr. Kendall and Mrs. Dyson, they thought they could outrun their pasts, but it's never so simple, is it?" She let the conversation drift, her eyes catching a glimpse of Molly Kendall through the lounge window, moving slowly along the garden path, her golden hair catching the light, her face pale but resolute. Molly, Miss Marple knew, was the case's quiet victim, betrayed by a husband whose charm had masked a criminal past and a lover's ruthless ambition. Tim's confession had spared her from suspicion, painting her as an innocent blindsided by his schemes, and Miss Marple's heart ached for her. She recalled their brief exchange the previous day, Marley's tearful denial, her plea that Tim was not a monster, and resolved to offer a final gesture of kindness before her departure. Rising, her parasol in hand, she made her way to the garden, her steps slow but purposeful. She found Molly near the hibiscus hedge, arranging a bouquet of flowers, her movements mechanical, as if seeking solace in routine. "Mrs. Kendall," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle, "I hope I'm not intruding. I'm leaving tomorrow, you know, and I wanted to say how much I've admired your strength through all this. It's been a dreadful time, but you've carried on so bravely." Molly looked up, her eyes shadowed but softening at Miss Marple's words. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low. I don't feel brave, Tim, he fooled me all these years. I thought I knew him, but he was someone else. Someone who'd killed to keep his secrets. And that woman, Lucky," she shuddered, her hands tightening on the flowers. "I don't know how to go on, but I have to, for the hotel, for myself." Miss Marple nodded, her face all sympathy. "You will, my dear," she said. "You're stronger than you know, and you've a good heart. The hotel's yours now, free of those shadows, and I've no doubt you'll make it shine again. People like you, Mrs. Kendall, they always find their way." She patted Molly's hand, her touch light but firm, and Molly managed a faint smile, her eyes glistening. "Thank you," she whispered, and Miss Marple, sensing her need for solitude, returned to the veranda, her heart lighter. Molly's resilience, like that of a young widow in St. Mary Mead, who had rebuilt her life after betrayal, reminded her that even in tragedy, hope could take root. She resumed her knitting, her thoughts turning to the other guests, whose roles in the drama had been peripheral but revealing. Evelyn and Edward Hillingdon, she noted, were packing their botanical samples in the garden, their reserved demeanour unchanged, but their tension eased. Miss Marple had suspected Evelyn's expertise in poisons, and Edward's silent watchfulness, but Tim's confession had cleared them, painting their guardedness as mere professional caution. She approached them, her parasol shielding her from the sun, her voice soft. "Mr. and Mrs. Hillingdon," she said, "I'm leaving tomorrow, and I wanted to say how much I've enjoyed seeing your work. Your plants are quite remarkable, though I confess, I'm glad they're in safe hands." Evelyn's sharp features softened, and she smiled, a rare warmth in her eyes. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she said. "It's been a difficult time, but your insight helped end it. We're scientists, you know, not sleuths, but we're grateful for your courage." Edward, looking up from his sketches, nodded, his usual distraction replaced by a quiet respect, and Miss Marple, her suspicions of them laid to rest, wished them well, her thoughts on the fine line between knowledge and intent. Back in the lounge, she observed Lucky Dyson's absence, a void filled by the guests' whispers about her arrest. Tim's confession had painted her as the mastermind, her flirtatious charm a mask for ruthless ambition, and Miss Marple, recalling her nervous glances and careless chatter, saw the truth of it. Lucky's affair with Tim, their plan to siphon the hotel's funds, and her orchestration of the murders to protect their secret had been a gamble that failed, undone by a photograph and an old lady's persistence. Miss Marple thought of St. Mary Mead, where a scheming outsider had once met a similar fate, and knitted quietly, her satisfaction tempered by the waste of such cunning. The afternoon brought a final encounter with Dr. Graham, who sought her out. On the veranda, his weathered face creased with gratitude. "Miss Marple," he said, settling beside her, "I owe you an apology. I thought you were just a curious old lady, but you've outdone us all. Daventry, says Kendall, and Dyson would have slipped through without you. That notebook, trick brilliant. If risky, you've a mind like a steel trap." Miss Marple smiled, her knitting steady. "No apology needed, Doctor," she said, her voice soft. "I've seen a few things in my time, you know, and people are much the same, whether in a village or a hotel. Greed, fear, love, they drive us to terrible things, but they also leave traces if one looks closely." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "I'm glad it's over, for Molly's sake. She'll need kind people like you to help her rebuild." Dr. Graham nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "She will, and we'll do our best. You're off tomorrow, then? Back to your quiet life. I suppose though I suspect it's not as quiet as you let on." He chuckled, and Miss Marple, her expression vague, murmured something about her garden, her thoughts already drifting to St. Mary Mead's familiar intrigues. The evening's farewell dinner was a subdued affair, with guests dining under lanterns, the steel drum band playing softly. Molly, presiding with quiet dignity, thanked everyone for their patience, her voice steady despite her pallor. Miss Marple, seated with the Prescotts, declined a dance but accepted a glass of lemonade, her eyes on the guests, the Cannon's genial chatter, Joan's brisk organization, the Hillingdons' reserved warmth, the absence of Greg and Lucky, a reminder of the cost of greed. She thought of Palgrave, whose indiscreet boast had triggered the chain of deaths, and Victoria, whose curiosity had sealed her fate, and felt a quiet resolve to honor their memory by ensuring such truths were never ignored. As the dinner ended, Miss Marple took a final walk through the gardens, her parasol folded, the moonlight casting silver patterns on the paths. The hibiscus hedge, where she had glimpsed Tim's vial, stood silent, its blooms closed for the night, and she paused, her thoughts on the case's resolution. The photograph, likely destroyed, had been the spark, but human nature its flaws, and desires had been the fuel. She recalled St. Mary Mead, where a garden's weeds had once revealed a killer's haste, and smiled faintly, her heart at peace. Returning to her bungalow, she packed her knitting, her fingers lingering on the needles that had been her quiet allies. The next morning, she boarded a car to the airport, declining Canon Prescott's offer of a bridge game in London, her mind already on her village's familiar rhythms. As the plane soared over the Caribbean, its turquoise bays fading below, Miss Marple opened her knitting, her eyes bright with memory. "Just like the vicarage garden," she murmured, her needles clicking softly, "weeds always show themselves in time."